You are standing in a muddy field in northern France. It's October 25th, 1415, and you're about to experience one of the most brutal, terrifying, and absolutely disgusting days of your life. You're a French knight, which sounds cool until you realize you're wearing about 60 pounds of metal in the pouring rain. You haven't slept properly in days. You're probably malnourished, and you desperately need to take a shit, but there's no way you're getting out of this armor in time. Across the field, maybe 300 yards away, you can see the English army. They look pathetic. Maybe 6,000 men, most of them archers who aren't even proper soldiers. They're dirty, they're starving. Half of them have dysentery. Your side? You've got somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 men. This should be a massacre. You should roll right over them. Spoiler alert, you're about to get absolutely demolished. Welcome to the Battle of Agincourt, and welcome to medieval warfare, where everything you think you know about war is probably wrong. See, we have this romanticized view of medieval combat, don't we? Knights in shining armor, glorious cavalry charges, honorable single combat, maybe a dragon or two if we're feeling spicy. The reality? Medieval warfare was a horrific, chaotic, disease-ridden nightmare where you were more likely to die from dysentery than from a sword, where tactics often meant charge at them and hope for the best, and where the Geneva Conventions were about 700 years away from existing. So literally anything goes. Today we're diving deep into what war actually looked like in the Middle Ages, not the Hollywood version, not the video game version, the real, brutal, often absolutely ridiculous version. We're talking about how battles actually worked, what weapons really did to human bodies, why castles were simultaneously brilliant and terrible, how diseases killed more soldiers than combat ever did, and why being a medieval soldier was possibly one of the worst jobs in human history. And look, I'm going to level with you. This is going to get dark. Medieval warfare was not pretty. People died in horrible ways. War crimes were basically just called Tuesday. But we're also going to find some absolutely hilarious moments, because medieval people, for all their violence, were also incredibly weird and sometimes accidentally comedy gold. So strap in, grab your imaginary sword that you definitely don't know how to use properly. Try not to think about the fact that you haven't bathed in 3 months. And let's talk about what war really looked like in the Middle Ages. It's going to be bloody, it's going to be brutal, and it's definitely going to smell worse than you can possibly imagine. Part 1. The reality of medieval armies. Chapter 1. Who actually fought in medieval wars? Let's start by destroying your first misconception about medieval warfare. The idea that armies were made up of professional soldiers who trained their whole lives for combat. Wrong. So wrong. Here's the truth. If you were a peasant in medieval Europe, which statistically you absolutely were, because like 90% of people were peasants, your primary job was farming. You planted crops, you harvested crops, you tried not to starve, you paid taxes to your lord. You maybe went to church on Sunday if you weren't too exhausted. That was your life. And then one day, your lord's messenger shows up at your pathetic little hovel and says, "Hey, the king's going to war. You need to grab whatever sharp thing you own and report for military service in 3 days." And you're just standing there holding a turnip, thinking, "I'm a farmer. I farm turnips. I don't know how to stab people." Too bad. You're in the army now. This was called the feudal levy, and it was how medieval armies were primarily built. Your lord owned the land you farmed, and in exchange for that arrangement, you owed him military service. Usually this was limited. Maybe 40 days a year, sometimes less. But during those 40 days, you were a soldier whether you liked it or not. Now, did this create effective armies? Well, define effective. These levy armies were basically a mob of farmers with pointy sticks who had maybe a few days of training if they were lucky. Most of them had never been in a real fight in their lives. They didn't know formations. They didn't know tactics. They knew how to plant wheat and milk cows, and that's about it. But here's the thing, everyone's army was like this, so it kind of evened out. Of course, there were also professional soldiers. Knights, for instance, were basically professional warriors. They trained from childhood in combat, horsemanship, and the art of hitting people with metal objects. They were the medieval equivalent of special forces, highly trained, well-equipped, and absolutely convinced of their own superiority. And to be fair, a trained knight in full armor was a genuinely terrifying opponent. Imagine a tank, but it's a guy, and he's on a horse, and he's really angry. That's a knight. They were expensive to train, expensive to equip, and expensive to maintain. A full suit of plate armor could cost as much as a small village. A trained warhorse could cost as much as several farms. This created an interesting dynamic. Knights were valuable. Peasant levies were expendable. If a knight got captured in battle, his opponent would usually ransom him back to his family for a nice chunk of money. If a peasant got captured in battle, his opponent would usually just kill him, because who's going to pay a ransom for a turnip farmer? Then you had mercenaries, professional soldiers who fought for whoever paid them. These guys were actually often more effective than either knights or levies, because fighting was literally their job. They did it full time. They had experience. They had skills. They also had absolutely no loyalty to anyone except money, which meant they'd switch sides if someone offered them a better deal. And they were notorious for committing atrocities because, hey, it's not their country they're burning down. The most famous medieval mercenaries were probably the Swiss pikemen, who were so effective at killing people with really long spears that they basically dominated European battlefields for like 200 years. More on them later. You also had specialized troops. Archers, for instance, particularly the English longbowmen, who were so good at shooting arrows that they basically rewrote medieval warfare. Crossbowmen, who used a weapon that was easier to learn but slower to reload. Siege engineers who knew how to build and operate siege weapons. Miners who dug tunnels under castle walls. But the bulk of any medieval army, farmers, just farmers. Farmers who would really rather be farming. Chapter 2. Training, or lack thereof. So you're a medieval peasant, and you've been called up for military service. Great. How much training do you get? The answer is not much. If you were lucky, your lord might gather the levy troops a few times a year for some basic training. This usually consisted of learning to march in vaguely the same direction as everyone else, learning to hold a spear without stabbing yourself or your buddy, learning to follow basic commands like advance and retreat and please stop running away. Maybe some practice fighting against other peasants who also have no idea what they're doing. That's it. That's your military training. Now, if you were training to be a knight, things were very different. Knight training started in childhood, usually around age 7, when you'd be sent to another noble's household to serve as a page. You'd learn reading, writing, religion, and basic combat skills. At around age 14, you'd become a squire, basically a knight in training who served an actual knight. You'd help him put on his armor, which was a whole complicated process, take care of his weapons and horse, and accompany him to battles and tournaments. You'd also continue training in combat, sword fighting, lance work, horsemanship, all of it. If you survived to around age 21 and proved yourself worthy, you'd be knighted in a ceremony that involved a lot of religious symbolism and someone hitting you with a sword, in a ceremonial way, not a trying to kill you way. So knights had like 14 years of training. Peasant levies had like 14 days if they were lucky. This created some interesting problems on the battlefield. For instance, getting a bunch of untrained peasants to maintain formation while people are shooting arrows at them and charging at them with horses is, shall we say, challenging. Medieval commanders quickly learned that peasant levies were great for making your army look bigger. Soaking up arrows meant for more important people. Doing manual labor like digging trenches or building camps, panicking and running away, thus spreading panic to the rest of your army. They were less great for actually winning battles, following complex tactical maneuvers, standing their ground against a cavalry charge, not dying immediately. The solution? Put the trained troops, knights, men-at-arms, professional soldiers, in the front and center where the real fighting would happen. Put the peasant levies on the flanks or in the rear where they could provide support, make noise, and hopefully not screw things up too badly. And pray that the enemy didn't figure out that your flanks were defended by farmers with pointy sticks. Chapter 3. Equipment and Arms. Let's talk about what people actually fought with. If you're imagining every soldier in gleaming plate armor with a sword and shield, I have bad news for you. Plate armor didn't become common until the late medieval period. We're talking 14th and 15th centuries. Before that, armor was mostly chainmail, which is exactly what it sounds like. Thousands of tiny metal rings linked together into a shirt. Chainmail was actually pretty effective against slashing attacks. Someone swings a sword at you, the chainmail will probably prevent it from cutting you. Unfortunately, it did absolutely nothing against blunt force trauma. Someone hits you with a mace or a warhammer. That force is going straight through the chainmail into your body. Congratulations, you now have several broken ribs. And chainmail was expensive. A full suit of chainmail cost a fortune, way more than a peasant could afford. So most common soldiers wore whatever armor they could scrounge up. Maybe a leather jerkin, maybe a padded jacket called a gambesson that could absorb some impacts. Maybe just their regular clothes and a helmet if they were lucky. Speaking of helmets, these were actually one of the most important pieces of equipment because getting hit in the head tended to be fatal. A good helmet could save your life. Unfortunately, good helmets were also expensive. So many soldiers made do with simpler versions or just wore a metal cap. Now weapons. The sword is the iconic medieval weapon, right? Knights drawing their swords for honorable combat. Yeah, swords were actually kind of a sidearm. They were expensive to make, required skill to use effectively, and weren't even the most effective weapon on the battlefield. What was? The spear. The humble spear was the king of medieval battlefields. Why? Cheap to make. Stick was pointy metal. Bit. Spear. Easy to use. Point the sharp end at the enemy. Long reach. You can stab someone before they can stab you. Effective against cavalry. Horses really don't like running into a wall of pointy sticks. Seriously, the spear was everywhere. Most common soldiers carried spears. They were the AK-47 of the medieval world. Simple, effective, reliable. Then you had pole arms, which were basically spears on steroids. Halberds, bills, glaives, poleaxes. These were long weapons that combined a spear point with an axe blade, or a hammer. They could stab, chop, hook, and pull. They were incredibly versatile and became the primary infantry weapon in the later Middle Ages. The Swiss pikemen I mentioned earlier, they used pikes, which were basically really, really long spears, sometimes up to 18 feet long. They'd form a formation called a pike square, where everyone had these massive pikes pointing outward, creating an impenetrable wall of pointy death. Cavalry charging at a pike square was basically suicide. Axes and maces were popular because they were effective against armor. An axe could chop through chainmail or dent plate armor. A mace or warhammer could deliver devastating blunt force trauma right through armor. These became increasingly important as armor got better. Crossbows were controversial. The Pope actually tried to ban them in 1139 because they were too deadly and allowed a common peasant to kill a noble knight from a distance, which was apparently unfair. The ban didn't work, obviously. Crossbows were easier to use than regular bows and required less training, making them popular. And then there were longbows, English longbows specifically. These things were insane. They had a draw weight of like 150 pounds, meaning you needed incredible upper body strength just to pull the string back. English archers trained from childhood, and you can actually identify medieval English archers' skeletons because their arm bones are deformed from years of pulling those massive bows. But the result? An experienced longbowman could shoot 10-12 arrows per minute, accurately up to 200 yards. Against massed formations, they could just aim high and rain arrows down. The arrows could punch through chainmail at close range. A few thousand longbowmen could blanket a battlefield in arrows, turning the sky dark. It was terrifying. This is what happened at Agincourt. The French had more men, better armor, more knights. The English had longbowmen. The longbowmen won. Chapter 4. Design, Economics of War. Here's something they don't tell you about medieval warfare. It was incredibly expensive. Raising an army cost a fortune. You had to pay wages to professional soldiers and mercenaries, provide food for thousands of men and horses, supply weapons and armor, transport everything to wherever the war was happening, build siege equipment, pay for medical care, such as it was, deal with all the logistical nightmare of moving thousands of people across medieval Europe. And medieval kings were not rich in the way we think of today. They didn't have enormous treasuries of gold. Their wealth was mostly in land and the taxes they could extract from that land. Want to raise an army? You need to raise taxes. Want to sustain a long campaign? You need even more money. This is why medieval wars were often short. Kings would gather their armies, campaign for a few months. Remember, feudal levies only owed 40 days of service. Try to accomplish something, then everyone would go home before the money ran out. It's also why looting was such a big part of medieval warfare. Armies were expected to live off the land, which is a nice way of saying steal everything from the local peasants. Your crops? The army's now. Your livestock? The army's now. Your daughter? Well, yeah, medieval armies were not good house guests. This was called chevauchée in French warfare, a deliberate strategy of burning, looting, and destroying the enemy's countryside to damage their economy and force them to come out and fight. It was economically devastating and absolutely brutal for civilians. And mercenaries made this worse because they often looted even when they were on your side. They needed to get paid. And if their employer ran out of money, they'd just help themselves to the local peasant stuff or switch to the other side. The cost of equipment was also staggering. A destrier, a war horse trained for combat, could cost as much as 10-20 years of a skill. Workers' wages, a suit of plate armor, similar price. A castle? Forget about it. Castles cost an absolutely stupid amount of money to build and maintain. This is why warfare was largely a nobleman's game. Only the wealthy could afford to fight as knights. Only kings could afford to field armies. Peasants fought because they had to, not because they could afford to. And here's a fun fact. Ransoming captured nobles was a legitimate business strategy. Knights would capture enemy nobles, hold them for ransom, and make a fortune. Some knights basically funded their entire lifestyle through ransoms. It was like kidnapping, but socially acceptable if everyone involved was rich enough. This is why battles often tried to capture rather than kill enemy nobles. Dead nobles pay no ransom. Living nobles could be worth a fortune, unless you were a peasant, in which case you just died and nobody cared. Part 2. The Battlefield Experience. Chapter 5. How battles actually started. Okay, so you've been conscripted into a medieval army. You've received approximately 15 minutes of training. You've been given a spear that you're pretty sure is older than your grandfather. And now you're marching to battle. What happens next? First, let's destroy another myth. Battles were actually pretty rare in medieval warfare. I know, shocking. You'd think with all the wars happening, there'd be battles all the time. But here's the thing. Battles were risky, really risky. A commander could spend years building up an army, gathering resources, and planning a campaign, only to lose everything in a single afternoon if the battle went badly. So medieval commanders tried to avoid pitched battles whenever possible. They'd rather besiege castles and cities. We'll get to that nightmare later. Raid enemy territory to destroy their economy, maneuver for better strategic positions, negotiate, literally do anything except risk their entire army in open combat battles. Usually, only happened when one side was forced to fight. like their castle was under siege and relief forces showed up. One side was so confident they thought they couldn't lose. Spoiler, they often did lose. Both sides encountered each other unexpectedly and couldn't withdraw. Political pressure demanded it. Kings had to look tough for their nobles. When battles did happen, they didn't start immediately. Medieval armies didn't just charge at each other like in the movies. First, you'd have the approach. Both armies would see each other, probably from miles away, because medieval terrain was mostly open fields, and you could spot thousands of men and horses from a distance. Commanders would assess the situation. Is the terrain favorable? Do we have the numbers? What's the enemy doing? Then you'd have the deployment. This could take hours. Armies would form up into their battle lines, organize their divisions, position their archers, place their cavalry, arrange their reserves. Medieval armies didn't have radios or signal flags or any easy way to communicate, so getting thousands of men into the right positions was a massive undertaking. During this time, both sides could see exactly what the other was doing. There was no surprise. You'd watch the enemy organize their forces, and they'd watch you organize yours. It was like the world's most stressful chess game, except the pieces were people, and the stakes were death. Commanders would ride along the lines, giving speeches. These speeches probably followed a formula. The enemy are cowards and scum. God is on our side. Think of the glory and honor. Also, if you run away, I'll have you executed. Then there'd often be a period of just waiting. Both armies staring at each other across the battlefield, men getting nervous, some vomiting from fear, others praying, some joking to cover their terror. All of them knowing that soon, very soon, everything would go to absolute hell. Sometimes there'd be skirmishing first. Light cavalry or archers would harass the enemy, trying to provoke them into attacking or disrupt their formation. This could go on for hours. And then finally, someone would decide to commit. Usually this was signaled by trumpet calls or drums or flags. The army would start advancing. In movies, this is where everyone screams and runs at each other at full speed. In reality, medieval armies usually advanced slowly, walking, not running. Why? Because running in armor is exhausting, and you'd be completely gassed before you even made contact. Maintaining formation while running is nearly impossible. You need to save your energy for the actual fighting. Cavalry could charge at speed, but infantry couldn't. So you'd have thousands of men slowly walking toward each other across a field, getting closer and closer until they were in range, and that's when the arrows started flying. Chapter 6. The Arrow Storm. If there were archers involved, and there usually were, the battle would open with an exchange of missiles that would make modern firefights look tame. Imagine you're in that formation of infantry, slowly advancing. You can see the enemy lines getting closer. Your heart is pounding. Your mouth is dry. You're gripping your spear so hard your knuckles are white. And then you hear it. A sound like wind, but wrong. You look up. The sky goes dark. Thousands of arrows, fired in high arcs, descending on your formation like deadly rain. This was the reality of medieval archery in battle. Archers didn't carefully aim at individual targets like in the movies. They loosed volleys, hundreds or thousands of arrows, all at once, aimed at the general area where enemy troops were massed. It didn't matter if each arrow hit someone. Statistically, enough would hit that the effect was devastating. English longbowmen at Agincourt were shooting 10 to 12 arrows per minute. 1,000 longbowmen could put 10,000, 12,000 arrows in the air every minute. For reference, that's insane. And medieval arrows weren't just pointy sticks. These were bodkin points, narrow, armor-piercing arrowheads designed to punch through chainmail. At close range, they could even penetrate plate armor at the joints. If you were wearing armor, an arrow might not kill you, but it would absolutely ruin your day. Arrows would stick in your armor, making movement difficult. They'd wound horses, causing them to panic. They'd kill or wound the unarmored men around you. The noise alone, thousands of arrows whistling through the air and slamming into shields, armor, and bodies was psychologically devastating, and you couldn't really fight back against archers unless you had archers of your own. You just had to endure it. Keep walking forward. Watch your friends drop around you. Hope you don't catch an arrow in the face. Crossbowmen worked differently. Crossbows were more powerful than regular bows and could punch through armor more reliably, but they were much slower to reload. A crossbowman might get off 2-3 shots per minute compared to a longbowman's 10-12. This created interesting tactical situations. At Crécy in 1346, the French had Genoese crossbowmen who were some of the best in the world. The English had longbowmen. The crossbowmen started shooting first. The longbowmen responded by absolutely burying them in arrows. 6 longbow shots for every 1 crossbow bolt. The Genoese broke and ran. The French cavalry, thinking the crossbowmen were cowards, rode them down and killed them. Then the English archers killed the French cavalry. It was a disaster. The arrow storm phase of battle could last anywhere from a few minutes to over an hour, depending on ammunition supplies and whether anyone was stupid enough to keep standing in it. Eventually, armies would get close enough for melee combat, and that's when things got really ugly. Chapter 7. The Melee. Organized chaos, you've survived the arrows. Congratulations now. Comes the fun part. Trying to stab people while they try to stab you. Medieval melee combat was nothing like movie sword fights. There was no elegant choreography, no one-on-one duels, well mostly, no dramatic pauses for banter. It was a chaotic shoving, stabbing, screaming nightmare. The initial contact between 2 formations was called the shock. Imagine 2 walls of men carrying spears and shields, slamming into each other at walking speed. The front ranks would collide. Spears would thrust forward. Shields would bash against shields. Men would push and shove, trying to break the enemy formation. And then it became a pushing contest, seriously. Medieval battles were partly decided by which side could literally push the other side backward. The men in the rear ranks would push against the men in front of them, who'd push against the enemy, trying to create pressure that would break their formation. This is why morale was so important. If your front rank started to give way, the men behind them would feel it and panic. Once one part of the formation broke, the whole thing could collapse. The actual fighting was brutal and exhausting. You'd stab with your spear over and over, trying to hit the enemies in front of you while avoiding their weapons. You'd use your shield to block attacks. You'd shove and push, all while wearing armor, if you had any, and carrying weapons in whatever weather conditions existed. Medieval battles mostly happened in summer and fall, but that doesn't mean they were pleasant. Fighting in the sun while wearing armor was like being inside an oven. Knights would literally cook inside their armor. Heat, exhaustion, and dehydration killed plenty of warriors. If you were in the front rank, you'd fight until you were exhausted, which could be as little as 2-3 minutes of intense combat. Then you'd try to fall back and let fresher troops take your place, if your army was organized enough to allow that. If not, you just kept fighting until you dropped. The noise was indescribable. Thousands of men shouting battle cries, screaming in pain, officers bellowing orders, weapons clanging against armor and shields, horses neighing, wounded men crying for help. It was sensory overload, and it smelled. Oh God, did it smell! Thousands of unwashed men who had been marching for days or weeks, many of whom had already pissed or shit themselves in fear. Blood, which has a distinctive metallic smell. Vomit. The smell of opened bowels when someone got gut stabbed. Horses were often involved, and horses produce a lot of shit. Medieval battlefields were assault courses for all 5 senses, and none of those senses were having a good time. The ground would quickly become treacherous. Blood, mud, dropped weapons, bodies of the dead and wounded. The battlefield would transform into an obstacle course where one wrong step could get you killed. At Agincourt, the field was muddy from rain. French knights in full plate armor got stuck. in the mud and couldn't get up. English soldiers would just walk up and stab them through the visor slits or the joints in their armor. Drowning in mud while being stabbed through the eye was a legitimate way to die in medieval combat. Delightful. Chapter 8: Cavalry Charges. The medieval shock and awe. Now, let's talk about what everyone thinks is the coolest part of medieval warfare: cavalry charges. A cavalry charge was genuinely terrifying. Imagine, you're standing in your infantry formation, you've survived the arrows, you're preparing for melee combat, and then you hear thunder. Not actual thunder. Hoofbeats, hundreds of horses, charging at you at full gallop. On top of those horses are knights in full armor, lowering their lances, heading straight for your position. The psychological impact alone was enormous. Horses are big, fast, and scary. War horses were trained to be aggressive, and the knights on top were the elite warriors of medieval society, convinced of their own superiority and really good at killing people. The tactic was simple. Charge at full speed into the enemy formation. Use the weight and momentum of horse and rider to smash through their lines, cause chaos and panic, then ride down anyone trying to flee. When it worked, it was devastating. A successful cavalry charge could break an entire army in minutes. Infantry would panic, break formation, and run. And running infantry are easy targets for cavalry. The majority of casualties in medieval battles often happened during the pursuit phase, when cavalry chased down fleeing infantry and cut them down from behind. But here's the thing, cavalry charges often didn't work. See, horses are smart, and horses really don't want to impale themselves on a wall of spears. A well-disciplined infantry formation with spears or pikes pointing outward could usually stop a cavalry charge just by standing there. The horses would refuse to charge into the spears and would veer away at the last second. This is why cavalry charges were most effective against already disrupted formations, against flanks or rear positions, or against troops who were already demoralized. It's also why the English longbowmen won so many battles. They'd shoot the horses, causing them to panic and throw their riders or crash into their own formations. A charging knight whose horse just got shot and is now rolling on the ground is no longer a terrifying warrior. He's just an angry man in a metal suit having a really bad day. Heavy cavalry, the fully armored knights on armored war horses, were incredibly effective, but also incredibly expensive and limited. A war horse could only make a few charges in a battle before it was exhausted, and if the charge failed, those knights were often stuck in the middle of enemy infantry and could be pulled down and killed. Light cavalry was different. These were horsemen with lighter armor, or no armor, whose job was to scout, harass enemy formations, chase down retreating enemies, and raid supply lines. They were faster and more versatile than heavy cavalry, but couldn't deliver the same devastating charge. Medieval battles often came down to this. Could your infantry hold against the enemy cavalry long enough for your own cavalry to smash into the enemy's flanks? Or would your cavalry charge fail, leaving your infantry to get rolled over? It was rock, paper, scissors on a massive, deadly scale. Chapter 9: When Things Went Wrong. Let's talk about all the ways a medieval battle could go absolutely sideways. First, friendly fire. Medieval battles were chaotic. Formations got mixed up. Visibility was terrible. Between the dust, smoke from any fires, and the sheer mass of bodies, you often couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Units attacking from different angles could end up fighting each other by mistake. There's a famous story from the Battle of Barnet in 1471, where the Lancastrian forces attacked each other in the fog because they mistook their own badge for the enemy's. They basically defeated themselves through friendly fire. Commanders losing control was another huge problem. Once the battle started, there was no good way to communicate across the battlefield. Trumpet signals and flags could be used for basic commands, like advance or retreat, but complex tactical adjustments were nearly impossible. This meant that if your plan didn't survive first contact with the enemy, and plans never survived first contact, you were kind of screwed. Units would do their own thing, pursue enemies when they should have held position, or retreat when they should have advanced. At the Battle of Crécy, French cavalry made repeated, uncoordinated charges against English positions throughout the day. Each charge failed, but there was no way to stop the knights in the rear from charging because they couldn't see what was happening at the front, and they weren't going to listen to orders to stand down anyway. It was a slaughter. Panic and rout were constant dangers. Medieval armies were made up largely of untrained peasants who really didn't want to be there. If they started to break and run, the panic would spread. Once a rout started, it was almost impossible to stop. And routing was often a death sentence. As I mentioned, most casualties happened during the pursuit. Running away from cavalry meant exposing your back, the part not protected by your shield, and making yourself an easy target. A properly organized retreat was difficult. A panicked rout was a massacre. Weather could ruin everything. Rain would turn battlefields into mud, making movement difficult and causing soldiers to slip and fall. It would also render bowstrings useless. Wet bowstrings don't work, which is why English archers famously unstrung their bows and kept the strings under their helmets when it rained. Heat could be just as bad. Fighting in summer sun while wearing armor led to heat, exhaustion, and dehydration. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin deliberately fought the Crusaders in summer heat after cutting them off from water sources. The Crusaders, wearing full armor in desert heat without water, were so exhausted they could barely fight. Terrain was crucial and could completely determine the outcome. High ground gave you advantages. Forests prevented cavalry from operating. Rivers created natural barriers. Muddy ground slowed heavy cavalry and infantry. Smart commanders would choose their battlefield carefully. Stupid commanders would attack anyway and get their armies destroyed. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. Worse than the battle. Congratulations! You survived the battle. Your side won. Time to celebrate, right? Wrong. The aftermath of a medieval battle was often worse than the battle itself. First, looting the dead. This was standard procedure. After a battle, soldiers would strip the bodies of the fallen, friend and foe alike, taking armor, weapons, money, jewelry, clothes, anything of value. This wasn't considered disrespectful. This was how soldiers supplemented their income. Knights would specifically look for dead or wounded nobles to ransom. As I mentioned earlier, a captured noble was worth a fortune. A dead noble was worth whatever you could loot from his body. For common soldiers, the pickings were slimmer, but even a dead peasant might have a decent knife or a pair of boots that were better than yours. The wounded presented a problem. If you were wealthy and got wounded in battle, you might be taken for ransom and receive medical care. Terrible medical care, but still. If you were a common soldier and got wounded, you'd probably just be left to die on the battlefield. Medieval battlefield medicine was, let's call it, limited. Doctors understood some basics, like you should stop bleeding and keep wounds clean, but they also believed in treatments like bloodletting and applying bizarre poultices made of herbs and animal shit. Many wounded soldiers died from infection rather than their wounds. A slash wound that might be easily treatable with modern antibiotics would become infected and kill you a week later in the medieval period. And then there was the psychological trauma. We don't talk about this much when discussing medieval warfare, but soldiers absolutely suffered from what we'd now call PTSD. Medieval chronicles describe soldiers who couldn't sleep, who had nightmares, who couldn't function after witnessing the horrors of battle. But medieval society didn't have psychological support or understanding of mental health. You were just expected to deal with it. Many soldiers turned to alcohol. Others became increasingly violent. Some had mental breakdowns. The battlefield itself, after the fighting, was a horror scene. Thousands of bodies left to rot. In summer heat, decomposition would start quickly. The smell would be overwhelming. Scavengers, both human and animal, would descend on the field. Burial details would try to clear the bodies, but with medieval technology, burying thousands of corpses was a massive undertaking. Often bodies would just be left in mass graves or piled up and burned. Burned bodies smell awful, by the way. Medieval people knew this. They did it anyway. Local peasants suffered tremendously. A battle fought on your farmland meant your crops were destroyed, your livestock taken or killed, your property looted. The armies, both sides, would have been taking your food and resources. You might have been pressed into service-burying bodies or treating wounded. And if your side lost, the enemy army might spend the next few weeks systematically destroying your entire region, burning crops, killing livestock, and generally making sure you couldn't support your lord's war effort. Chapter 11. The ones who got away. Retreats and pursuits. Let's talk about what happened to the losing side. If your army lost the battle, the first priority was getting out alive. This is where the real massacre usually happened. An organized retreat where units fell back in good order, maintaining some formation and discipline, could save an army from total destruction. But organized retreats were rare. Most defeated armies routed, broke, and ran in a panicked mass. And this is when cavalry earned their pay. Light cavalry especially would pursue fleeing infantry for miles, cutting them down from behind. A man running away, exhausted, probably having thrown away his weapons and shield to run faster, was an easy target. Medieval chronicles are full of battles where the combat itself lasted a few hours, but the pursuit lasted for days. The Battle of Agincourt's main engagement lasted a few hours. The pursuit and slaughter of French forces lasted much longer. If you were trying to escape after a defeat, your options were run and hope you were faster than the cavalry chasing you. You weren't. Hide and hope they didn't find you, they might. Surrender and hope they took you prisoner instead of killing you. Depends on if you looked valuable. Play dead and hope nobody checked. Risky, looters would stab corpses to make sure they were actually dead. Many soldiers who escaped the immediate battle would die from their wounds later, or from exposure, or from starving because their army had been destroyed and they had no way to get home. Some would turn to banditry. Armed men with combat experience and no employment would rob travelers and raid villages. Medieval Europe had a huge problem with former soldiers becoming bandits after wars ended. The lucky ones would make it home, where they'd probably find that their farms had been raided, their families had starved, and the lord who conscripted them had already forgotten they existed. Medieval warfare was just absolutely brutal for everyone involved, except maybe the nobles, who could afford to pay ransoms. Part 3. Siege Warfare. The Medieval Waiting Game. Chapter 12. Why castles existed, and why everyone hated them. Alright, so we've covered field battles. Now let's talk about the other major type of medieval warfare, sieges. And let me tell you, sieges were somehow even worse than battles. Here's the thing about medieval Europe. It was absolutely covered in castles. Every noble with enough money built a castle. Kings built castles. Rich merchants built fortified towns. By the height of the Middle Ages, you couldn't travel more than a day's journey in most of Europe without encountering some kind of fortification. Why? Because castles worked. A castle was basically a military force multiplier. A few dozen defenders in a well-built castle could hold off an army of thousands. Let me explain the math here. If you've got 50 guys inside a castle with thick walls, murder holes, and plenty of supplies, an attacking army might need literal thousands of soldiers to have any hope of taking it. This created a fundamental problem for medieval warfare. You couldn't just march your army past enemy castles. They'd sally forth and attack your supply lines, raid your camps, and generally make your life miserable. You had to deal with them, but dealing with a castle meant laying siege to it. And sieges were absolutely terrible for everyone involved. Let's start with the castle itself. Early medieval castles were mostly motte and bailey designs, a wooden fort on top of a mound, motte, with an enclosed courtyard bailey at the base. These were cheap and quick to build, but had an obvious flaw: wood burns. So castles evolved. Stone keeps became standard, then curtain walls, high stone walls surrounding the entire castle complex, then concentric castles with multiple layers of walls, then all sorts of defensive features, murder holes, gaps in ceilings above gateways where defenders could drop rocks, boiling liquids, or shoot arrows at attackers below. Crenellations, those tooth-like battlements you see on castle walls that defenders could hide behind while shooting. Machicolations, projecting parapets with holes for dropping things on attackers at the base of walls. Arrow slits, narrow windows that archers could shoot through while being almost impossible to shoot back at. Moats, ditches filled with water to prevent undermining and make approach difficult. Drawbridges, bridges that could be raised to prevent access. Portcullises, heavy metal gates that dropped down to block entrances. Barbicans, fortified gatehouses with their own defenses. Castle designers were basically in an arms race with siege engineers, each trying to outwit the other. Castles got more complex and expensive. Siege techniques got more elaborate and expensive. Everyone spent ridiculous amounts of money on this. A well-designed castle could withstand a siege for months or even years if it had enough supplies. Which brings us to the critical question: what decided? Sieges, not walls, not weapons, supplies, specifically food and water. A castle could have impregnable walls, but if the defenders ran out of food or water, they'd have to surrender. This meant that preparing for a siege involved stockpiling massive amounts of supplies: grain, salted meat, dried fish, wine, ale, anything that could be stored long term. Water was especially critical. Many castles had wells inside their walls. If your well ran dry during a siege, you were screwed. There are records of castle defenders surrendering, not because the walls were breached, but because the well went dry and they were dying of thirst. Chapter 13. Life Under Siege. The Defender's Nightmare. Imagine you're a defender in a besieged castle. What's your daily life like? First, you're trapped. You can see the enemy army surrounding your castle. Thousands of soldiers camped outside, building siege equipment, settling in for a long stay. You can't leave. Any attempt to exit the castle would result in you being immediately captured or killed. The enemy's first move is usually to surround the castle completely, cutting off all supplies and reinforcements. This is called investment. You're now isolated. Then the waiting begins. In the early days of the siege, morale might be okay. You've got walls, you've got supplies, you've got a defensible position. The enemy's out there in tents getting rained on while you're safe inside. But as weeks turn into months, things deteriorate. Food supplies start to dwindle. Rationing begins. You go from 3 meals a day to 2, then to 1. The food gets worse. You eat the fresh supplies first, then move to the preserved stuff, which tastes terrible. Eventually, you're down to whatever scraps remain. Water becomes precious. If you're lucky enough to have a well, you ration it carefully. If you're depending on rainwater collection, you pray for rain. Disease is a constant threat. You've got dozens or hundreds of people living in close quarters with medieval sanitation, which is to say almost no sanitation. Human waste piles up. Rats multiply. Disease spreads. Dysentery was the big killer in sieges. Bad water or contaminated food would lead to severe diarrhea and dehydration. In a siege situation where water was already scarce, dysentery could kill faster than enemy weapons. Scurvy would set in after a few months without fresh food. Your teeth start falling out. Your old wounds reopen. You bruise easily. You feel constantly exhausted. Typhus, spread by lice, living in clothes and bedding, would sweep through crowded castle garrisons. It caused high fever, headaches, and a rash. It killed probably, and all the while, you'd be under constant harassment from the besieging army. Arrows and crossbow bolts would fly over the walls at random times, forcing you to stay under cover. Siege weapons would pound the walls. You'd never get a full night's sleep because you'd need to maintain watches and respond to potential attacks, the psychological pressure was immense. You're trapped, you're hungry, you're sick, your friends are dying from disease or enemy action, and you don't know if relief is coming or if you're just going to slowly starve to death. Some garrisons would hold out heroically for months. Others would negotiate surrender terms after a few weeks. It depended on the commander's determination, the state of supplies, and whether they believed relief was possible. Surrender negotiations were an art form. The attackers wanted the castle but didn't want to lose more soldiers taking it. The defenders wanted to survive but didn't want to be executed for resisting. So they'd negotiate. Honorable surrender. Defenders allowed to leave with their weapons and dignity. Conditional surrender. Defenders leave but must swear oaths not to fight again. Surrender with guarantee of safety. Defenders become prisoners but aren't harmed. But here's the nasty bit. If a castle refused to surrender and was eventually taken by force, the laws of war allowed the attackers to kill everyone inside. This was meant to incentivize surrender. It sometimes led to massacres. The siege of Chateau Gaillard in 1203-1204 is a perfect example of siege misery. The castle was held by the English against the French. As supplies dwindled, the commander expelled all the useless mouths: civilians, women, children, elderly, anyone who couldn't fight, to conserve food for the soldiers. These expelled civilians begged to pass through the French siege lines. The French refused. They wanted the castle to run out of food faster, so they wouldn't let the civilians leave. These poor people were trapped between the castle walls and the French siege lines, starving in no man's land. Many died there. Eventually, the French allowed them to pass, but only after weeks of suffering. Medieval siege warfare was absolutely brutal for everyone involved. Chapter 14. Life under siege. Fu Ihoam, attacker's nightmare. Now let's flip perspectives. You're a soldier in the besieging army. This should be better than being trapped inside, right? Wrong. Being the besieger sucked too. First, sieges took forever. Months, sometimes years. You're camping outside a castle in whatever weather conditions exist, eating field rations, and basically doing nothing except maintaining the siege. Medieval armies didn't have good tents for common soldiers. If you were lucky, you had a canvas shelter. More likely, you had whatever you could cobble together from branches and cloth. When it rained, and it rained a lot in medieval Europe, you got wet and stayed wet. Your clothes would be constantly damp. You'd develop skin infections and trench foot. Yes, really. Food was a constant problem. An army of thousands needed tons of food every day. This had to be brought in via supply trains, wagons coming from miles away. Those supply trains were vulnerable to raids by the enemy's allies, or by the castle's defenders if they mounted a sortie. Local food sources would be exhausted quickly. The army would strip the surrounding countryside of anything edible. Local peasants would starve. After a few weeks, you'd be dependent entirely on those supply lines. And food quality in a siege camp was terrible. Bread, if you were lucky. Salted meat or fish. Pottage, a kind of grain and vegetable stew. No fresh vegetables after the first few weeks. Scurvy became a problem for besiegers too. Water was often contaminated. Medieval armies would camp near rivers or streams, but thousands of men and horses using the same water source meant that source got polluted fast. Dysentery and other waterborne diseases would tear through a siege camp. Speaking of disease, siege camps were disease factories. Thousands of men living in close quarters with poor sanitation, contaminated water, and inadequate food. Disease killed more besiegers than combat ever did. The mortality rate in a prolonged siege could be staggering. At the Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, 1189-1191, disease killed thousands of crusaders. The camp was filled with sick and dying men. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Boredom was another enemy. Most of your time was spent just waiting, maintaining the siege lines, standing guard doing nothing. Medieval armies didn't have entertainment. No books for common soldiers. No music except what they made themselves. Just sitting around, waiting, slowly dying from disease and malnutrition. Morale would plummet. Soldiers would desert if they could. Discipline would break down. Fights would break out over food, loot, gambling debts, and all the while you'd be vulnerable to attack. The castle's defenders might sally forth, suddenly open the gates and attack your siege camp. They'd aim to destroy your siege equipment, kill soldiers, capture supplies, then retreat back inside before you could respond. Or a relief army might show up to break the siege. Then you'd have to fight a battle, while also maintaining the siege, splitting your forces and putting you at a disadvantage. Chapter 15. Siege Weapons. Medieval Artillery. Okay, so you're besieging a castle and waiting for starvation to work seems like it's taking too long. You want to actually attack the walls. How do you do that? Enter siege weapons, the medieval equivalent of artillery. Let's start with the trebuchet, probably the most famous medieval siege weapon. A trebuchet was basically a giant sling powered by a counterweight. You'd load a stone or other projectile into a sling, release the counterweight, which could weigh several tons, and the arm would whip around and hurl the projectile at the target. Large trebuchets could throw stones weighing 300 pounds or more, over 300 yards. That's a lot. A 300-pound rock hitting a stone wall at high velocity would cause serious damage. Trebuchets were devastatingly effective, but also incredibly expensive and time-consuming to build. You needed skilled engineers, tons of timber, and time to assemble them on site. But once operational, they could pound castle walls day after day. What did people throw with trebuchets? Stones, the standard ammunition, dead animals, to spread disease inside the castle. Yes, biological warfare. Dead prisoners, psychological warfare, and disease spreading. Beehives, to cause chaos. Angry bees inside a castle would be terrible. Incendiaries, pots of burning material to start fires. Pots of excrement, because medieval people were gross and wanted to demoralize defenders. There's a famous story from the siege of Karlstein Castle in 1422, where Hussite defenders allegedly loaded a soldier onto a trebuchet and launched him into the attacking forces. He survived and became a legend. This story is probably apocryphal, but it's a good story. Catapults were similar but used tension, twisted ropes, or sinew, rather than counterweights for power. They were generally smaller and less powerful than trebuchets, but faster to build and operate. Ballistas were basically giant crossbows that fired massive bolts or stones. They were accurate and could target specific points on walls or specific defenders. A ballista bolt could punch through a man in armor and kill the person behind him too. Siege towers were mobile fortifications, tall wooden towers on wheels that could be rolled up to castle walls. Soldiers inside the tower would be protected from arrows and could then use a drawbridge at the top to access the castle walls directly. Building a siege tower was a massive undertaking. You needed timber, carpentry skills, and a way to make it mobile. You'd often cover it with wet hides to protect against fire. Then you'd slowly roll it across the battlefield toward the walls while defenders shot at it, threw things at it, and tried to burn it. If you successfully got a siege tower to the wall, soldiers would storm across the drawbridge onto the battlements and try to take that section of wall. This led to brutal close-quarters combat on top of castle walls. Battering rams were simple but effective. A large wooden beam, often with a metal cap, used to smash through gates or walls. Rams would be suspended from a wooden framework so they could be swung back and forth to build momentum. The problem with rams was that you had to get them right up to the wall or gate, which meant being in range of defenders above who would drop rocks, shoot arrows, pour boiling water or oil, and generally try to kill you. So ram crews would build protective covers, wooden structures called cats or tortoises, that shielded the ram crew from above. These would be covered with wet hides to protect against fire. Rams were most effective against gates, which were usually the weakest point in castle defenses. A good ram crew could break through a wooden gate in hours. Chapter 16. Undermining. Literally, here's a siege. Tactic that doesn't get enough attention: mining. No, not landmines. Actual mining. Digging tunnels under castle walls. Here's how it worked. Siege engineers would dig a tunnel from their camp toward the castle wall, going underground to avoid being shot at. The tunnel would go under the wall's foundation. Once there, they'd excavate a large chamber, propping up the ceiling with wooden supports. Then they'd fill the chamber with combustible materials: wood, straw, animal fat, and set it on fire. The supports would burn through, the chamber would collapse, and the wall above would come crashing down. This was incredibly effective if you could pull it off. Castles were designed to defend against attacks from above ground. They weren't designed to defend against attacks from below. The problem? It was difficult, dangerous work. Digging tunnels with medieval tools was slow. Cave-ins could kill your miners. You needed skilled engineers who understood soil stability. In castle, defenders would try to detect mining operations. They'd place bowls of water on the ground. If the water rippled, someone was digging underground nearby. They'd have watchmen literally put their ears to the ground to listen for digging sounds. If defenders detected a mine, they'd try to countermine, dig their own tunnel to intercept the enemy tunnel. Then you'd have underground battles where miners from both sides would fight each other in cramped, dark tunnels. This was nightmare fuel. There are accounts of these underground battles being some of the most brutal combat in medieval warfare. Fighting in complete darkness, in confined spaces with mining tools as weapons. Absolutely horrific. If the countermining failed and the wall came down, the besiegers would storm the breach. This led to some of the bloodiest fighting because the breach would be filled with rubble, making movement difficult. It was a choke point where defenders could concentrate their forces. Both sides knew this was potentially the decisive moment of the siege. Breaches were slaughterhouses. Soldiers would climb over rubble while defenders shot at them, threw rocks, and fought them hand to hand. The attackers would try to pour through in enough numbers to overwhelm the defense. The defenders would try to hold long enough to build internal barricades. Chapter 17. Escalade. The desperate option. If you didn't have time or resources for mining or siege engines, there was always the option of simply scaling the walls. This was called escalade, using ladders to climb the walls while defenders tried to kill you. It was basically suicide unless you had overwhelming numbers or the defenders were already demoralized. Here's why escalade was terrible. You'd approach the wall carrying a ladder. Defenders above would shoot at you with arrows and crossbows. If you survived to reach the wall, you'd place your ladder and start climbing. While climbing, you'd have one hand on the ladder. You need that to not fall. One hand holding your weapon and/or shield. No good way to defend yourself from above. Defenders would shoot at you with arrows, drop rocks on you, pour boiling water or oil on you. Hot oil was actually rare because oil was expensive. Boiling water worked fine. Use forked poles to push your ladder away from the wall, sending you crashing down. If you were in armor, falling from a ladder meant serious injury or death. If you weren't in armor, you were an easy target for arrows. If you actually made it to the top of the wall, you'd have to fight your way onto the battlements, while defenders tried to stab you, push you off, or just bash you with rocks. Successful escalades usually only happened when, for dawn, the defenders were already weakened and demoralized. The attackers had huge numerical superiority. Multiple escalades happened simultaneously, spreading the defenders too thin. The escalade was combined with other attacks, trebuchets, rams, etc., to overwhelm the defense. Otherwise, it was just sending men to die at the base of the walls. Chapter 18. Starvation. The waiting game. Despite all these fancy siege weapons and tactics, the most common way to take a castle was still the oldest and simplest: Wait for the defenders to starve. A proper blockade meant preventing anything from getting in or out of the castle. No food, no water unless they had a well. No reinforcements, no information. Just sit there and wait for them to run out of supplies. This could take months or years, but it worked. Eventually, the defenders would run out of food and starve, run out of water and die of thirst, succumb to disease, lose morale, and surrender. The psychology of starvation is brutal. You can endure a lot when you think relief is coming, but when you realize no one's coming to save you, when you're watching your friends die from hunger, when you're so weak you can barely stand, you surrender. Some famous sieges lasted incredibly long. The siege of Kenilworth Castle in England, 1266, lasted 6 months. The siege of Harlech Castle in Wales, 1461-1468, lasted 7 years. 7 years. During these prolonged sieges, castles would go through predictable stages. Stage 1, optimism. We have supplies, we can hold out. Relief will come. Stage 2, rationing. Okay, supplies are running low. Cut everyone's rations by half. Stage 3, desperation. We're eating the horses. We're eating rats. We're boiling leather for whatever nutrition it might have. Stage 4, negotiation or death. We need to surrender or everyone's going to die. There are grim accounts of besieged garrisons resorting to cannibalism in the final stages. During the siege of Ma'ara in 1098 during the First Crusade, starving crusaders allegedly ate the bodies of dead Muslim defenders. Medieval warfare was not pretty. Chapter 19, when sieges went weird. Medieval sieges sometimes involved truly bizarre tactics that sound made up, but are well documented. At the siege of Chateau Gaillard, which I mentioned earlier, French forces eventually won by having a small team climb up through the castle's latrine chute. Yes, the toilet. They literally climbed up through a vertical shaft filled with human waste to enter the castle. Imagine being the soldiers chosen for that mission. Okay, boys, we need volunteers to climb up the ship pipe. The bravery is impressive. The smell must have been indescribable. During the siege of Limoges in 1370, English forces under the Black Prince successfully mined under the walls. When the wall collapsed, the English poured through and massacred most of the city's population, around 3,000 people. This was considered acceptable at the time because the city had refused to surrender. The siege of Nicaea in 1097 during the First Crusade involved the Byzantines secretly transporting ships overland to the lake beside the city, then launching a surprise naval attack while Crusaders assaulted the walls. The city surrendered to the Byzantines to avoid being captured by the Crusaders, who had a reputation for massacres. At the siege of Acre, 1189-1191, both sides built elaborate siege works. The Crusaders built siege towers and trebuchets. The Muslim defenders built their own trebuchets inside the city and had a counter-battery war with the Crusaders, basically medieval artillery duels. Disease was so bad at Acre that both the Christian and Muslim forces were dying in huge numbers. Kings died of disease during this siege. The smell from unburied corpses was reportedly unbearable. Some castles held out through sheer audacity. Chateau Gaillard, before its eventual fall, was defended by Roger de Lacy with just 200 men against an army of thousands. They held for 6 months through winter. The siege of Orléans in 1428-1429 was famously broken by Joan of Arc leading a relief force. She inspired the defenders to sally forth and defeat the English besiegers in a series of attacks. This turned the tide of the 100 Years' War. Sometimes sieges ended in negotiated settlements that were almost comically specific. You can leave with your weapons, but not your horses. You can take your personal property, but not the castle's supplies. You must walk north and not return for 6 months. Also, you have to leave your best wine. Medieval people loved detailed contracts, even in warfare. First Years Part 4, The Human Cost, Disease, Death, and Suffering. Chapter 20: The Real Killer, Disease. Alright, let's talk about what actually killed most medieval soldiers. Spoiler, it wasn't swords, it was disease. Specifically, it was dysentery, typhus, typhoid fever, and various other infections that turned medieval armies into mobile death camps. Here's the fundamental problem with medieval armies. You're taking thousands of men, cramming them together in unsanitary conditions, feeding them terrible food, giving them contaminated water, and then marching them around the countryside for months. This is literally a recipe for epidemic disease. Dysentery, also charmingly known as the bloody flux, was the single biggest killer. It's caused by bacteria or parasites in contaminated food or water, and it causes severe diarrhea and dehydration. In a modern hospital with IV fluids and antibiotics, it's treatable. In medieval army camps, with no clean water and no understanding of germ theory, it was a death sentence for thousands. Imagine, you're already malnourished because army rations are terrible. You're drinking water from a stream that thousands of other soldiers and horses have been using. Someone upstream has dysentery. They shit in or near the water. You drink the water. Now you have dysentery. You start having severe diarrhea. We're talking 10-20 times a day. You're losing fluids faster than you can replace them. You become dehydrated, weak, feverish. Your body can't absorb nutrients. You waste away. And there's no treatment. Medieval doctors might try bloodletting, removing blood from a sick person because they thought disease was caused by bad humors, which would just make you weaker. They might give you herbal remedies that did nothing. Mostly you just suffered until you either recovered or died. During the Third Crusade, dysentery killed more crusaders than combat by a factor of probably 10-1. King Richard the Lionheart himself caught it and was sick for weeks. Common soldiers just died. Typhus was another major killer. It's spread by lice living in clothing and bedding. Medieval soldiers rarely changed clothes and never washed them. Lice were everywhere. Typhus would sweep through armies, causing high fever, headaches, and a characteristic rash. Mortality rates were around 10-60% depending on the strain. You couldn't escape lice in a medieval army. Everyone had them. Rich, poor, knight, peasant, everyone was lousy, literally. The term going through with a fine-tooth comb comes from using specialized combs to remove lice from hair. Typhoid fever was similar but caused by contaminated food and water. High fever, weakness, abdominal pain, sometimes death. Again, no treatment. Camp fever was a catch-all term for various epidemic diseases that would sweep through military camps. Sometimes it was typhus, sometimes typhoid, sometimes other bacterial infections. Medieval people didn't understand the differences. They just knew that large numbers of soldiers would suddenly get sick and die. Plague obviously deserves mention. The Black Death, 1347-1353, killed something like 30-60% of Europe's population. It made warfare essentially impossible during its peak years because you couldn't gather armies without them immediately getting infected. But plague continued to recur in smaller outbreaks throughout the medieval period. An army marching through a plague-infected region might lose half its strength to disease before even reaching the enemy. Respiratory infections were common too. Pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis. These would spread through camps, especially in winter or in cold, wet conditions. Soldiers sleeping in damp conditions, poorly clothed, malnourished. Perfect environment for lung infections. Wound infections killed many soldiers who survived the initial injury. A sword cut that might seem minor would become infected. Without antibiotics, these infections would spread. Sepsis would set in. The wound would turn gangrenous. Medieval doctors would amputate if they could, but amputation itself often led to death from shock or infection. Here's a fun fact. More soldiers died from disease in armies than were killed in all the battles combined. It's not even close. For every soldier killed in combat, probably 5-10 died from disease. The irony is that medieval people had no idea why disease spread. They didn't understand germ theory. They thought disease was caused by bad air, miasma theory, or divine punishment, or imbalanced humors in the body. So they do things that made disease worse. Camp near swamps because water access, not realizing swamps bred disease-carrying mosquitoes. Dump waste near water sources, contaminating them. Keep sick and healthy soldiers together, spreading disease. Use the same surgical instruments on multiple patients without cleaning them. Treat wounds with poultices made from animal dung. Yes, really. It wasn't until the 19th century that people figured out that maybe washing your hands and boiling your water might help prevent disease. Medieval armies just accepted that a certain percentage of soldiers would die from mysterious illnesses. Chapter 21. Medieval Medicine. Good intentions, terrible results. So you're a wounded or sick medieval soldier. What kind of medical care can you expect? Well, it depends on who you are. If you're a wealthy noble or knight, you might have access to an actual physician, someone who studied medicine at a university. These physicians had read ancient texts by Galen and Hippocrates. They understood human anatomy to some degree. They could set broken bones, treat some wounds, and prescribe medications. Unfortunately, their understanding was based on ancient Greek theories that were often completely wrong. They believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and thought disease was caused by imbalances in these humors. So their treatments included bloodletting, cutting you to drain excess blood, purging, giving you substances to make you vomit or have diarrhea to expel bad humors, cauterization, burning wounds with hot irons to prevent infection. This actually sometimes worked by killing bacteria, but not for the reasons they thought. If you were a common soldier, you weren't seeing a physician. You were seeing a barber surgeon. Barber surgeons were exactly what they sound like. Barbers who also did surgery. They hadn't attended university. They learned their trade through apprenticeship. They were the people who'd pull teeth, set broken bones, amputate limbs, drain abscesses, let blood, cut your hair. The famous red and white striped barber pole, that comes from barber surgeons. Red represented blood. White represented bandages. Charming. Barber surgeons were hit or miss. Some were skilled and could successfully perform amputations or treat wounds. Others were butchers who'd kill you faster than your wound would. Amputation was common for severely wounded limbs. The procedure was: 1. Get the patient drunk. Alcohol was the only anesthetic. 2. Tie a tourniquet above the amputation site. 3. Cut through the flesh with a knife. 4. Saw through the bone. 5. Cauterize the wound with a hot iron to stop bleeding. 6. Pray the patient didn't die from shock or infection. The survival rate for amputation was maybe 50-50. Better odds than gangrene, but not great. For wound treatment, medieval surgeons had some practices that actually worked. Cleaning wounds with wine or vinegar. The alcohol had some antibacterial properties. Using honey on wounds. Honey is naturally antibacterial. Stitching wounds closed with silk or gut thread. But they also did things that definitely didn't work. Applying poultices made from herbs, animal dung, and spider webs. Believing that pus was a good sign. It wasn't, it meant infection. Treating everything with bloodletting. There were some genuinely skilled medieval surgeons. Hugh of Lucca and his son Theodoric, 13th century, argued against putting ointments on wounds, believing they should be kept clean and dry. This was revolutionary and actually correct, but most surgeons ignored them. Medieval dentistry was nightmare fuel. Got a toothache? The barber surgeon would pull the tooth with pliers. No anesthetic except maybe alcohol. No understanding of sterile technique. Just grab and pull. Root canals didn't exist. Fillings didn't exist. If your tooth was bad, it came out. Many people lost most of their teeth by middle age. For diseases, medieval medicine was even more useless. A physician might prescribe special diets, sometimes helpful, often not, herbal medicines. Some had actual medicinal properties, many didn't. Bloodletting, almost never helpful. Amulets and charms, definitely not helpful. Prayers, couldn't hurt, probably didn't help medically. Some herbal remedies actually worked. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, and was used for pain and fever. Certain herbs had anti-inflammatory or antiseptic properties, but the doses were inconsistent. The preparations varied wildly, and nobody really understood why some herbs worked and others didn't. Medieval hospitals existed, but they were more like hospices than modern hospitals. They provided care for the sick and dying, but they couldn't actually cure most diseases. They'd keep patients clean, fed, and comfortable while they either recovered or died. Monasteries often ran hospitals and provided care as a Christian duty. Monks and nuns would tend to the sick, which was admirable but medically limited since they had no more understanding of disease than anyone else. Chapter 22: The Walking Wounded. Let's talk about what happened to soldiers who survived their wounds but were permanently disabled. If you lost a limb in medieval warfare, you were basically done as a soldier. Prosthetics existed but were crude: wooden peg legs, hook hands, that sort of thing. They were better than nothing but didn't restore function. A knight who lost his sword arm couldn't fight anymore. His career was over. If he was wealthy enough, he might retire to his estates. If not, he was reduced to whatever work he could do with one arm. Common soldiers who were disabled had it worse. They couldn't return to farming if they'd lost a leg. They couldn't do manual labor if they'd lost an arm. They might become beggars, relying on charity. Medieval society had some provisions for disabled veterans. Monasteries might give them alms. Lords might provide pensions to soldiers who'd served them loyally. But many disabled veterans ended up destitute. Then there were the less visible disabilities. We don't have medieval diagnoses of PTSD, but we have plenty of descriptions of soldiers who couldn't sleep, who had nightmares, who jumped at loud noises, who couldn't function in normal society after experiencing the horrors of war. Some became violent and erratic. Some turned to alcohol. Some withdrew completely. Medieval society didn't understand psychological trauma and had no treatment for it. Chronic pain was another issue. Medieval medicine couldn't do much for it. You might use willow bark or opium. Yes, medieval people had access to opium for pain relief, but that was about it. Many soldiers lived with constant pain from old wounds, broken bones that healed poorly, or arthritis from years of wearing armor and fighting. The life expectancy for medieval people wasn't great to begin with, maybe 30-40 years on average. Soldiers who'd been through multiple campaigns might be so broken down by their 30s that they were effectively elderly. Chapter 23: Prisoners and Ransoms. We've talked about this a bit, but let's go deeper into what happened to prisoners of war. Medieval warfare had an interesting dual nature when it came to prisoners. If you were noble, just wealthy, you'd probably be taken for ransom. If you were common, you'd probably be killed. Why? Economics. A captured noble was worth a fortune. Kings would pay enormous ransoms to get their nobles back. After the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the French King John II was captured by the English. His ransom was 3 million gold crowns, an absolutely staggering sum that took years to raise and nearly bankrupted France. So there was a strong incentive to capture nobles alive. In fact, battles between knights sometimes looked more like kidnapping competitions than actual combat. Knights would try to capture each other for ransom rather than kill each other. This led to some weird situations. At Agincourt, English forces captured thousands of French nobles. King Henry V was worried that these prisoners might rearm and fight again if things turned badly, so he ordered them executed. This was considered a horrific breach of the rules of war, but Henry did it anyway because military necessity trumped honor. The massacre of prisoners at Agincourt shows the dark side of medieval warfare. The rules about ransoming nobles only applied when it was convenient. When it wasn't, the rules went out the window. For common soldiers, There was no ransom value. Capturing peasant levies just meant feeding extra mouths with no financial benefit. So captured common soldiers were usually killed on the spot, enslaved, pressed into service for the capturing army, held for mass prisoner exchanges. Killing prisoners was common and generally accepted. After battles, wounded enemy soldiers would be dispatched by soldiers moving across the battlefield. This was partly mercy, killing wounded who would die anyway, and partly practicality. Can't leave armed enemies behind you. Enslavement was more common in regions with active slave trades, the Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, areas in contact with Islamic states. Captured Christians might be sold to Muslim slavers, and vice versa. Pressing prisoners into service happened sometimes. You can die, or you can fight for us instead. Some prisoners switched sides. Others deserted at the first opportunity. Armies made up partly of pressed prisoners were unreliable. Prisoner exchanges were negotiated between commanders. We'll trade 100 of your men for 100 of our men. This worked when both sides had significant prisoners, but broke down when one side had many more than the other. Chapter 24. Civilians in Wartime, the Forgotten Victims. Here's who really suffered most from medieval warfare. Civilians. Peasants whose land the armies marched across, whose crops were seized, whose animals were taken, whose daughters were raped, whose sons were conscripted, whose homes were burned. Medieval armies lived off the land, which meant they stripped the countryside of resources. An army of 10,000 men and several thousand horses needed tons of food daily. They'd take grain from peasant stores, leaving them to starve, livestock, leaving them without draft animals or meat, carts and wagons, making it impossible to transport what little they had left. Sometimes the peasants themselves as forced laborers. This was legal. Armies had the right to requisition supplies. In theory, they were supposed to pay for them or provide receipts for later compensation. In practice, this rarely happened. The chevauchée strategy I mentioned earlier was deliberate economic warfare through destroying civilian infrastructure. English armies in France would systematically burn crops, kill livestock, destroy mills and barns, and generally make the land unusable. The goal was to damage the enemy's economy and tax base. The result was mass starvation among the civilian population. During the 100 Years' War, large parts of France were devastated. Villages were abandoned. Fields went uncultivated because there was no one left to work them. Famine became endemic, and rape was unfortunately common. Medieval armies had no meaningful discipline regarding sexual violence. Soldiers would rape women in conquered towns or villages they passed through. This was seen as part of the spoils of war. Some commanders tried to limit rape and looting because it damaged morale and discipline, but enforcement was minimal. If you were a woman in a town that was being sacked, you were in grave danger. The sack of a city after siege was particularly brutal. The laws of war stated that if a city refused to surrender and was taken by force, the attackers could sack it for 3 days. Everything was fair game. Looting, rape, murder, arson. This was meant to incentivize surrender, but it meant that captured cities experienced apocalyptic violence. At the sack of Limoges in 1370, the Black Prince's forces killed around 3,000 civilians over several days. Children weren't spared. Entire families were killed. The elderly were killed. No one was safe. Some civilians fled from advancing armies, becoming refugees. They'd take what they could carry and head for cities or other regions. But medieval infrastructure couldn't support large refugee populations. Refugee camps, such as they were, became centers of disease and starvation. Chapter 25. The economic devastation war didn't just kill people, it destroyed economies. Agriculture was the foundation of medieval economies. Almost everyone was involved in farming. When armies destroyed crops and took livestock, the effects rippled outward. No crops meant no food, which meant famine among the local population. No surplus to trade or sell. No tax revenue for the lord. Economic collapse of the region lords derived their wealth from taxing peasants' agricultural production. If the peasants had nothing to harvest, there was nothing to tax. This meant lords couldn't raise armies, maintain castles, or fund further military operations. This created a vicious cycle. War destroyed the economy, which made it harder to wage war, which might prolong conflicts, as neither side could afford decisive operations, which meant more years of destructive low-level warfare. Infrastructure destruction was also economically devastating. Armies would burn mills, making it impossible to grind grain into flour, destroy bridges, making trade and travel difficult, burn towns and villages, destroying centers of craft production and trade. Rebuilding took years or decades. Some regions never fully recovered. Trade routes would be disrupted. Merchants wouldn't travel through war zones, meaning goods couldn't move and markets collapsed. The 100 Years' War, 1453, devastated France economically. By the end of the war, large parts of France were depopulated wastelands. It took generations to recover. Disease played a role too. The Black Death hit Europe in the mid-14th century, killing 60% of the population. This was a separate disaster from warfare, but it compounded the economic effects. With fewer workers, less land was cultivated. Economic output plummeted. Some regions benefited from war economically. Arms manufacturers, mercenary recruiters, supplies merchants. War is profitable for some, but for most people, it meant poverty, starvation, and death. First year with Part 5, Special Topics: the weird, the brutal, and the unexpected. Chapter 26, Naval Warfare. Violence on the water. Let's talk about something we haven't covered yet: medieval naval warfare. Because yes, people fought on boats too, and it was just as horrific as land warfare, but with the added bonus of drowning. Medieval naval warfare was fundamentally different from what came later. There were no cannons until the very late medieval period, no gunpowder weapons, no ability to sink ships from a distance with artillery. Naval battles were essentially land battles that happened to take place on boats. Here's how a typical medieval naval engagement worked. Ships would sail toward each other. Unlike later naval warfare, where you would try to sink enemy ships with cannons, medieval sailors tried to capture enemy ships. Why? Because ships were valuable. Sinking a ship meant losing its cargo and the ship itself. So the goal was to 1. Get close to the enemy ship. 2. Board it. 3. Kill or capture the crew. 4. Take the ship as a prize. To facilitate boarding, medieval warships had high forecastles and stern castles, raised platforms at the front and back of the ship where soldiers could stand and shoot down at enemy ships. These platforms were originally just wooden structures added to merchant ships to turn them into warships. As ships approached, archers would shoot at each other. Crossbowmen were particularly valuable on ships because you could brace the crossbow against the ship's railing for stability. Regular bows were harder to use on a moving vessel. The goal was to kill as many enemy crew members as possible before boarding. Deck space was limited, so even killing a dozen men could significantly weaken the enemy's ability to resist. Ships would also try to ram each other, though not to sink, to entangle. Some ships had grappling hooks they'd throw onto enemy vessels to lock them together. Once locked together, soldiers would board, and the melee would begin. Fighting on a ship was uniquely terrible because the deck was moving, making footing unstable. If you fell overboard in armor, you drowned immediately. There was nowhere to retreat to. Fire was a constant danger. Wooden ships plus fire, very bad. Fire ships were a legitimate tactic. You'd load a ship with combustible materials, set it on fire, and send it sailing toward the enemy fleet. If it reached enemy ships, the fire could spread and consume entire fleets. At the Battle of Sluys in 1340, English forces used fire ships against the French fleet to great effect. The French had chained their ships together for stability, also to prevent boarding. The English sent fire ships into the French formation. The fire spread from ship to ship along the chains. It was a massacre. Greek fire deserves special mention. This was a Byzantine invention, a liquid fire weapon that burned even on water. The Byzantines used it in naval warfare with devastating effect. Greek fire was projected from siphons on ships, basically flamethrowers. The exact composition of Greek fire is lost to history, but it was probably based on petroleum products. It was terrifying. Fire that water couldn't extinguish, that spread across the surface of the sea, that would stick to ships and men and burn them. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine being on a ship, seeing jets of fire shooting across the water toward you, watching your ship catch fire with no way to put it out. Byzantine naval forces dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, partly due to Greek fire. Drowning was obviously a major hazard. If your ship sank, from ramming, fire, or structural failure, you had seconds to get off before it dragged you down. If you were wearing armor, you drowned instantly. If you weren't wearing armor, you might survive if you could swim and if someone rescued you. But medieval people mostly couldn't swim. Swimming wasn't a common skill. If you went overboard, you probably died. There are accounts of entire battles where hundreds or thousands of men drowned. At the Battle of Dover in 1217, a French invasion fleet was defeated by English ships. Multiple French vessels sank. Hundreds of knights in full armor went into the water and never came back up. Medieval people also engaged in river warfare. Vikings famously used rivers to penetrate deep into Europe, raiding monasteries and towns. Their longships were designed to operate in shallow water and could be portaged, carried overland, past obstacles. The Viking longship was probably the most effective medieval warship. It was fast, could sail or be rowed, maneuverable. Shallow draft allowed operation in rivers. Versatile, could carry cargo or warriors. Intimidating. The dragonhead prows were psychological warfare. Vikings would sail up rivers, beach their ships, raid inland, then retreat to their ships before organized resistance could form. This hit-and-run strategy was devastatingly effective. European kingdoms built fortified bridges and river chains to stop Viking raids. River chains were exactly what they sound like. Huge chains stretched across rivers to prevent ships from passing. Vikings would sometimes portage around them or destroy them. Siege warfare from ships was also a thing. Ships could transport siege equipment and soldiers to coastal cities. The Siege of Constantinople in 1453, technically very late medieval, early Renaissance, involved Ottoman ships transporting cannons and troops. Some crazy bastards even transported ships overland. During the Siege of Constantinople, the Ottomans carried ships overland from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn. Miles of portaging warships across land to bypass Byzantine chain defenses. The logistics alone are mind-boggling. Chapter 27, Winter Warfare. Fighting in the cold. We talk a lot about summer campaigns, but what happened when armies fought in winter? Usually they didn't. Medieval armies typically campaigned from spring to fall, then everyone went home for winter. Why? Feeding an army in winter was nearly impossible. No crops growing, limited stored food. Movement was difficult. Snow, ice, frozen rivers, mud. Disease killed even more soldiers in cold, wet conditions. Soldiers were needed at home for winter preparations. But sometimes, armies did campaign in winter, and it was absolutely brutal. Winter campaigns happened when someone needed to act quickly and couldn't wait for spring. An army was already in the field and couldn't withdraw. Someone wanted to take advantage of enemy unpreparedness. The biggest challenge was food. Armies lived off the land, but in winter, there was no land to live off of. Fields were empty, animals were scarce. Stored food was hidden or defended by desperate peasants. Armies would starve, not figuratively, literally starve. Soldiers would die from malnutrition and exposure. The cold killed more than starvation. Medieval soldiers had wool clothing and maybe a cloak. That's it. No weatherproof materials, no insulation. When it was cold and wet, they stayed cold and wet. Hypothermia and frostbite killed thousands. Soldiers would lose fingers, toes, and extremities to frostbite. Some froze to death in their sleep. There are accounts of sentries being found frozen solid at their posts, dead from exposure. Rivers freezing changed warfare dynamics. A frozen river became a highway for armies that would normally be impassable. But it was also dangerous. Ice could break, plunging hundreds of men into freezing water. The battle on the ice, Lake Peipus in 1242, saw Teutonic knights fighting Novgorod forces on a frozen lake. According to tradition, probably exaggerated, the ice broke under the weight of knights in heavy armor, and many drowned. Whether this actually happened is debated, but it shows medieval understanding that fighting on ice was risky. Snow and ice made movement treacherous. Horses would slip and fall. Wagons would get stuck. Army supply trains would grind to a halt. Siege warfare in winter was especially terrible for both sides. Besiegers camped outside in winter conditions, freezing and starving. Besieged forces inside castles were warmer, but might run out of food faster if they hadn't prepared for winter. Some commanders used winter strategically. If you could move your army in winter, you'd catch enemies unprepared. The element of surprise was worth the suffering. Charles VIII of Sweden, much later but the principle applies, famously marched his army across frozen seas to attack Denmark in 1658. Nobody expected an army to move in winter across frozen water. The surprise was complete, but for every successful winter campaign, there were dozens that ended in disaster, with armies simply dissolving from starvation, disease, and desertion. Chapter 28: Religious Warfare. Crusades and Holy Wars. Medieval warfare had a unique element that modern warfare lacks to the same degree: religious fanaticism. The Crusades were religiously motivated military campaigns, primarily to capture Jerusalem from Muslim control, but also against heretics, pagans, and political enemies of the papacy. The First Crusade, 1096-1099, shows both the best and worst of medieval religious warfare. On one hand, Crusaders were motivated by genuine religious devotion. They believed they were fighting for God, that dying in crusade would guarantee them salvation. This made them incredibly determined and willing to endure hardships that might break other armies. On the other hand, religious fanaticism led to atrocities. The Rhineland massacres of 1096 saw Crusaders attacking Jewish communities in Germany on their way to the Holy Land. Thousands of Jews were killed. The Crusaders justified it by saying they were killing enemies of Christ, but really they were just murdering innocent civilians and stealing their wealth. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 ended with the Crusaders breaking into the city and massacring most of the population: Muslims, Jews, even some Eastern Christians. Contemporary accounts describe blood running through the streets ankle deep. Probably exaggerated, but it indicates massive killing. The Crusaders saw this as holy vengeance. Muslims saw it as barbaric slaughter. Both were right. Subsequent crusades saw similar brutality from both sides. The Muslim general Saladin was actually more merciful than many crusader leaders, allowing the Christian population of Jerusalem to ransom themselves when he recaptured the city in 1187 rather than massacring them. But other Muslim leaders were just as brutal as crusaders. The concept of jihad, holy war against unbelievers, motivated Muslim resistance to crusades. Religious warfare created a cycle of vengeance. Christians would massacre Muslims, citing previous Muslim attacks as justification. Muslims would massacre Christians, citing Crusader atrocities as justification. Neither side saw the other as fully human. The Children's Crusade of 1212 is particularly tragic. Thousands of children and adolescents, believing they could succeed where adults had failed, marched toward the Holy Land. Most died of disease and starvation. Some were sold into slavery. None reached Jerusalem. Whether this was actually a crusade, of literal children, or a movement of young adults and peasants, is debated by historians, but the name stuck because the outcome was so catastrophic. Religious military orders emerged from the Crusades: Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, Teutonic Knights. These were monks who were also soldiers, which sounds contradictory, but made sense in medieval thinking. The Templars became incredibly powerful, functioning as international bankers and warriors. They were so wealthy that Philip IV of France eventually accused them of heresy and destroyed the order to seize their assets. Many Templars were tortured and executed. Crusades against European heretics were particularly brutal. The Albigensian Crusade, 1209-1229, against Cathar heretics in southern France, was genocidal. Entire towns were massacred under the doctrine of "kill them all, God will know his own." The Northern Crusades against pagan Baltic peoples were campaigns of conquest disguised as religious. Conversion. The Teutonic Knights conquered and forcibly Christianized Prussia and other Baltic regions through decades of brutal warfare. Religious warfare was total war. There were no limits, no restraints, because the enemy wasn't just a political opponent. They were enemies of God himself. Chapter 29. Tournament and Judicial Combat. Formalized violence. Not all medieval combat was warfare. There was also ritualized combat, tournaments, and judicial duels. Tournaments started as military training exercises, where knights would practice fighting in relatively controlled conditions. Relatively being the key word, because early tournaments were incredibly dangerous. Early tournaments, 11th, 12th centuries, were basically mock battles between teams of knights. They'd fight with real weapons, though sometimes blunted, across open countryside. Captures counted for ransom, just like in real war. Injuries and deaths were common. The melee tournament was chaos. Dozens or hundreds of knights fighting in teams, charging back and forth, trying to capture opponents. It was considered great entertainment and good training, but it was also deadly. Many knights died in tournaments. William Marshall, one of the greatest knights of the 12th century, made a fortune capturing knights for ransom in tournaments, but also witnessed many deaths. The church repeatedly tried to ban tournaments, considering them too dangerous and a waste of resources. The bans didn't work. Knights loved tournaments too much. Over time, tournaments became more regulated and safer. The joust emerged as a popular tournament event. Two knights charging at each other with lances, trying to unhorse each other. Jousting had strict rules, specific armor, blunted lances usually, barriers between the horses to prevent collisions, point system for hits. But even with safety measures, jousting was dangerous. King Henry VI of France died from a jousting injury in 1559 when a lance penetrated his visor and destroyed his eye and brain. Tournaments claimed the lives of kings and commoners alike. Pas d'armes, passage of arms, was another tournament format where a knight or group of knights would hold a bridge or road and challenge all comers to fight. This could go on for days or weeks. These events were social spectacles. Ladies would watch, nobles would bet, heralds would announce combatants. It was sport, but violent sport. Then there were judicial combats, trial by combat. Medieval law allowed disputes to be settled by armed combat in some cases. The logic was that God would grant victory to the righteous party. This was trial by ordeal, taken to its logical extreme. If two parties had a dispute that couldn't be resolved by evidence, say, one accusing the other of murder with no witnesses, they could request trial by combat. They'd fight, and whoever won was legally in the right. If you were accused of a crime and challenged to trial by combat, you could fight yourself, hire a champion to fight for you, decline, and be found guilty. Professional champions existed, fighters who'd represent people in judicial combats for money. If you were a wealthy merchant accused of something and didn't know how to fight, you'd hire a champion. The combat would be supervised by officials and had rules. Both fighters used the same weapons, usually staff weapons or swords. The fight continued until one party yielded, was incapacitated, or died. If you lost trial by combat, you were guilty and would be punished, often executed. If you won, you were declared innocent, even if you'd actually committed the crime. This seems insane to modern minds, but medieval people genuinely believed God would intervene to ensure justice. Of course, this meant that the better fighter usually won, which might not correlate with actual guilt or innocence. Trial by combat slowly fell out of use as legal systems became more sophisticated, but it persisted into the 15th and 16th centuries in some regions. The famous combat between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris in 1386 was the last officially sanctioned judicial duel in France. Carouge accused Legris of raping his wife. Legris denied it. They fought. Carouge won, and Legris was posthumously declared guilty, and his body hung in chains. We'll never know if Legris actually committed the crime, but he certainly lost the fight. Chapter 30. Logistics, the boring stuff that determined everything. Okay, let's talk about the least exciting but most important part of medieval warfare: logistics. Logistics is how you move, supply, and maintain an army. It's not glamorous, it doesn't appear in movies, but it's what actually determined who won wars. Napoleon supposedly said, "An army marches on its stomach," and this was just as true in medieval times. Feeding a medieval army was a logistical nightmare. A soldier needed roughly 3,000 calories per day. A war horse needed about 20 pounds of grain and 25 pounds of hay daily. An army of 10,000 men with several thousand horses needed roughly 30,000 pounds of food for the men per day, tens of thousands of pounds of grain and hay for the horses per day. And you needed to find this food, transport it, and distribute it every single day. Medieval armies used several strategies. Living off the land, the army would forage from the countryside they marched through. This meant taking crops from fields and granaries, slaughtering livestock, stripping orchards and gardens, forcing peasants to give up their food stores. This strategy had obvious limits. After an army passed through a region, there was no food left. You couldn't march the same route twice. And in winter or early spring, when crops hadn't grown yet, there was nothing to forage. Supply trains. Armies would bring supply wagons carrying food, weapons, ammunition, and other necessities. This required hundreds or thousands of wagons, thousands of draft animals. 2. Pull them. Drivers and guards for the wagons. Routes that wagons could traverse supply trains were slow and vulnerable. A fast-moving cavalry force could raid and destroy supply trains, crippling an army. Protecting supply lines was crucial. The baggage train of a medieval army could be huge, sometimes longer than the army itself when strung out on the road. Depots and magazines. Some armies would pre-position supplies along their route. You'd stockpile food in castles or fortified towns ahead of time. Then the army would resupply as it marched. This required planning months in advance, securing the supply locations, enough wealth to purchase and stockpile supplies. Only well-organized kingdoms could manage this effectively. Naval supply. If fighting near coastlines or navigable rivers, supplies could be moved by ship. This was much more efficient than wagons, but required control of the waterways. The Crusades relied heavily on naval supply. Italian merchant cities would transport supplies to Crusader states for profit. Water was just as critical as food. An army needed thousands of gallons of water daily for men and horses. Armies would camp near rivers, lakes, or wells. If the enemy poisoned water sources, dumping dead animals in wells, fouling rivers, it could cripple an army. This was considered acceptable medieval warfare. Movement speed was limited by logistics. An army could only move as fast as its slowest wagons. Infantry might march 10 or 15 miles per day. Supply wagons might only make 5 to 10 miles per day. This meant campaigns moved at a crawl by modern standards. Moving an army 100 miles might take 2 weeks. Seasonal limitations were real. Campaigns happened spring through fall because winter had no food to forage. Spring mud made roads impassable. Fall harvest provided maximum food availability. The campaigning season was a real constraint. The size of armies was limited by logistics. You couldn't field an army of 100,000 men because you couldn't feed them. Most medieval armies were 5,000, 20,000 men for this reason. The rare times when armies exceeded this, like at Agincourt or Crécy, required extraordinary logistical preparation. Logistics determined strategy. Commanders planned campaigns around where food could be found, what routes supply wagons could travel, where water sources existed, how long supplies would last. A brilliant tactical commander with poor logistics would lose to a mediocre commander with good logistics. Every time. This is why castles were so important strategically. They were supply depots and logistics bases. Controlling castles meant controlling the ability to campaign in a region. Chapter 31: Communication and Command. How did anything get done? Commanding a medieval army was incredibly difficult because communication was terrible. There were no radios, no telephones, no signal flags, no real-time communication across a battlefield. Commanders had to rely on messengers, riders who carried verbal or written messages. This was slow. Even a fast rider might take hours to cover the distance of a large battlefield. Trumpets and drums, used for simple signals like advance, retreat, charge. Different calls meant different orders, but this only worked if soldiers could hear them over the noise of battle, and it could only convey simple messages. Flags and banners. Each unit had distinctive banners. Commanders could see where their units were by watching the banners, but this was passive information. You could see where units were, but you couldn't easily send them new orders. Visual signals. Things like raising a sword, pointing, firing a specific number of arrows. Very limited communication. Pre-battle planning. Since real-time communication was nearly impossible, commanders would plan the battle beforehand and hope units executed the plan. Once battle was joined, units were largely on their own. This created massive problems. Units getting separated and fighting independently. Units not receiving orders to retreat or advance. Commanders losing track of what was happening. Friendly fire from units that couldn't identify each other. Inability to coordinate complex maneuvers. Medieval battles were often chaotic, precisely because commanders couldn't control them effectively once they started. A commander's retinue, his household knights and trusted soldiers, would stay near him to protect him. Commanders were high-value targets. Act as messengers, form a reserve force. Provide information about what they could see, but their perspective was limited. In the middle of a battle, amid dust, smoke, and thousands of men, visibility was maybe a few hundred feet at best. Commanders sometimes used high ground specifically to improve visibility. At Agincourt, commanders on both sides positioned themselves where they could see more of the battlefield. The commander's personal banner was important. Soldiers would rally to it. If the banner fell, meaning the commander was dead or captured, it could cause panic and rout. Some battles were won or lost, based purely on perception. If soldiers thought their commander was dead, they'd flee, even if he was fine. If they saw the enemy commander's banner fall, they'd surge forward, even if he wasn't actually dead. Command and control improved slightly in the late medieval period with better use of signals and more professional armies, but it remained extremely limited. This is why medieval tactics were often simple. Form up, advance, hit the enemy, hope for the best complex. Maneuvers like pincer movements or coordinated attacks from multiple directions were incredibly difficult to execute. When they did work, like Hannibal's double, envelopment at Cannae, not medieval, but the principle applies. It was devastating, but they rarely worked because coordination was so hard. Part 6. The Evolution of Medieval Warfare. First, Chapter 32. Early Medieval Warfare. The Dark Ages. Let's rewind to the beginning of the Middle Ages, roughly 500–1000 AD, sometimes called the Dark Ages, though historians hate that term now. Early medieval warfare was different from what came later. The Roman Empire had fallen in the West, taking with it professional armies, sophisticated logistics, and organized military systems. What replaced it? Basically chaos. Early medieval armies were mostly tribal or clan-based war bands. A powerful chief or king would gather warriors from his tribe or kingdom. These warriors owed personal loyalty to their leader, not to any abstract concept of state. The Anglo-Saxons in England, the Franks in France, the Goths and Lombards in Italy, they all used similar systems. A warrior aristocracy would fight, while peasants mostly farmed and occasionally got conscripted. Equipment was simple. Most warriors had a spear, always the spear, a shield, wooden, sometimes with a metal boss, maybe a sword if they were wealthy, leather or padded armor, chainmail if they were really wealthy, no plate armor that wouldn't be invented for centuries. Battles were smaller scale than later medieval conflicts. An army of 5,000 men was considered huge. Most battles involved hundreds, not thousands. The shield wall was the dominant tactic. Warriors would line up shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward. Then the two shield walls would advance and slam into each other. The front rank would stab with spears over the shields. Men in the rear would push forward, adding weight and pressure. Whichever shield wall broke first would lose. This was brutal. Grinding combat, no fancy maneuvers, just pushing, stabbing, and trying to break the enemy's will. Cavalry existed, but was less dominant than it would become. Horses were expensive, and stirrups, which made cavalry charges more effective, hadn't been widely adopted yet. Vikings changed the game, somewhat. Their raids, roughly 793 1066 AD, introduced new tactics. Hit and run raids. Vikings would sail up rivers, raid monasteries and coastal towns, then disappear before organized resistance could form. They weren't interested in pitched battles. They wanted loot, use of ships as force multipliers. Viking longships could carry 40-80 warriors and could be beached almost anywhere. This gave Vikings incredible mobility. Professional warriors. Vikings were often professional raiders and traders. They fought for profit, not feudal obligation. This made them more effective than peasant levies. Berserkers were Viking warriors who fought in a trance-like fury. Whether this was drug-induced, psychological, or mythological is debated. They terrified enemies. The Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne, 768–814, introduced more organized warfare, heavy cavalry. Charlemagne's armies used mounted warriors more effectively than earlier Germanic armies. This was a precursor to later. Medieval knights, fortifications. Charlemagne built fortified outposts, burgs, throughout his empire. These would evolve into the castle system. Logistics. The Carolingian Empire had better logistical systems than most early medieval states. They could field larger armies and campaign further from home. But even Charlemagne's armies were limited by medieval standards. Campaigns were short, battles were rare. Raiding and skirmishing were more common than set-piece battles. Chapter 33, The Rise of Knights and Feudalism, 1000 to 1300 AD. Around 1000 AD, medieval warfare began to change dramatically. 3 innovations drove this. The stirrup. This seems minor, but stirrups changed cavalry warfare. With stirrups, a rider could brace himself and deliver a lance charge without being thrown off his horse. The couched lance charge, lance tucked under the arm, using the horse's momentum, became devastatingly effective. Feudalism. The feudal system created a class of professional warriors, knights, who trained from childhood and could afford expensive equipment. These became the dominant military force. Castles. Stone castles proliferated across Europe, changing siege warfare and strategic thinking. The knight became the premier warrior. Knights were trained from childhood in combat, equipped with the best armor and weapons, mounted on expensive war horses, expected to follow a code of chivalry, in theory. A fully equipped knight with armor, weapons, and warhorse represented a massive investment, equivalent to a modern tank. But like a tank, a knight could dominate a battlefield. Cavalry charges became the decisive tactic. Knights would form up in lines, lower their lances, and charge at full gallop. The shock of impact could shatter enemy formations. Infantry became less important. Peasant levies were considered cannon fodder. The real fighting was done by mounted knights. This created a two-tier military system. Knights: elite, expensive, effective. Everyone else: cheap, expendable, mostly ineffective chivalry emerged as a code of conduct for knights. In theory, chivalry meant fighting honorably, protecting the weak, showing mercy to defeated enemies, acting courageously. In practice, chivalry mostly applied when fighting other knights. It didn't apply to peasants, who knights treated as barely human. The Crusades, 1095-1291, were the ultimate expression of this knightly warfare. Heavily armored European knights went to the Holy Land to fight Muslim forces. Initially, European cavalry dominated. Muslim forces weren't used to heavily armored cavalry charges. Crusaders won several early victories through sheer shock tactics, but Muslim commanders adapted. They used light cavalry to harass and exhaust Crusader forces, avoided pitched battles when possible, and used the terrain and climate to their advantage. The Battle of Hattin, 1187, showed the limitations of heavy cavalry. Saladin trapped the Crusader army, away from water in summer heat. The knights, exhausted and dehydrated in their armor, were defeated. European warfare became more sophisticated during this period. Combined arms. Armies started using cavalry, infantry, and archers together more effectively. Siege warfare. Castles became more elaborate, and siege techniques evolved to counter them. Professional armies. While feudal levies remained common, mercenary companies and professional soldiers became more prevalent, but warfare was still dominated by the mounted knight. That would change in the 14th century. Chapter 34. The Infantry Revolution, 1300-1500 AD. The 14th and 15th centuries saw a dramatic shift in medieval warfare. Infantry, long considered inferior to cavalry, suddenly started winning battles. What happened? Several developments combined to dethrone the knight. Longbows. English longbowmen could shoot arrows that penetrated armor at close range. At Crécy, 1346, Agincourt, 1415, and other battles, English archers destroyed French cavalry. Pikes. Swiss pike formations used very long spears, 18 feet, in dense blocks. These pike squares could withstand cavalry charges and actually attack cavalry formations. Swiss pikemen dominated European battlefields for over a century. Crossbows. Increasingly powerful crossbows could punch through armor. While slower than longbows, they required less training. Gunpowder weapons, cannons, and early firearms began appearing. They were initially unreliable, but improved rapidly. Let's look at each. The English longbow was devastatingly effective, but required years of training. English law actually required regular archery practice. Boys would start training around age 7. By adulthood, an English longbowman could shoot 10-12 arrows per minute accurately, hit targets at 200 yards, penetrate chainmail at close range, sometimes penetrate plate armor at joints. At Crécy, English longbowmen positioned behind defensive stakes faced French cavalry charges. The arrows slaughtered the French horses and wounded knights. French casualties were around 10,000, 14,000. English casualties were maybe a few hundred. This was revolutionary. Common soldiers using simple weapons had defeated the mounted nobility. Swiss pike tactics were similarly revolutionary. Swiss cantons fielded armies of pike-armed infantry in dense formations. Each pikeman had an 18-foot pike. In formation, these pikes projected outward in all directions. A pike square was nearly impossible for cavalry to break. Horses wouldn't charge into a wall of pikes. The square could also advance. pushing enemies back. At the Battle of Morgarten, 1315, Swiss pikemen defeated Austrian knights by attacking them in a mountain pass where cavalry couldn't maneuver effectively. Swiss forces would dominate European warfare for the next 200 years. The combination of longbows and pikes meant infantry could defeat cavalry. This fundamentally changed medieval warfare. Knights didn't disappear, but they adapted. Late medieval knights fought on foot more often. Dismounted men-at-arms used heavier armor to counter arrows and pikes, employed firearms themselves, acted more as heavy infantry than shock cavalry. Plate armor reached its peak in the 15th century. Full suits of articulated plate could deflect most arrows and provide excellent protection, but they were incredibly expensive and didn't make knights invulnerable. At Agincourt, French knights in full plate armor got stuck in mud, fell down, and couldn't get up. English soldiers just walked up and stabbed them through the visor slits. The best armor in the world didn't help. Gunpowder weapons began appearing in the 14th century. Early cannons were unreliable, sometimes exploded, inaccurate, slow to reload, expensive. But they were psychologically terrifying. The noise, smoke, and unpredictability scared people and horses. Cannons were most effective in siege warfare. They could batter down castle walls more effectively than trebuchets. The age of the castle was ending because walls couldn't withstand cannon fire. Hand cannons and early firearms appeared by the mid-15th century. These were basically metal tubes on sticks that fired lead balls. They were inaccurate beyond 50 yards, slow to reload, maybe one shot per minute, dangerous to the user. Misfires were common, but they could penetrate any armor and required minimal training. A peasant with a month of training could kill a knight who'd trained his entire life. This was the final nail in the coffin for medieval warfare. By 1500, gunpowder weapons were becoming standard. The medieval period was ending, and the Renaissance, early modern period was beginning. Chapter 35. Mercenaries and Free Companies. War as business. Throughout the medieval period, but especially in the late Middle Ages, mercenaries played a huge role in warfare. Mercenaries were professional soldiers who fought for money, not loyalty or feudal obligation. They had several advantages over feudal levies. They were experienced fighters. They could be hired year-round, not just for 40 days. They had their own equipment. They could be dismissed when not needed. Famous mercenary companies included the Catalan Company, Spanish mercenaries who fought across the Mediterranean in the 14th century. They were so effective that the Byzantine Empire hired them, then tried to betray them. The Catalans responded by conquering parts of Greece and establishing their own states. The White Company, an English mercenary company in 14th century Italy, led by John Hawkwood. They fought for various Italian city-states, switching sides based on who paid more. The Condottieri, Italian mercenary captains, who essentially ran medieval Italy's wars. Some became so powerful they founded dynasties and ruled cities. Swiss mercenaries, Swiss pike companies hired out to various European powers. They were considered the best infantry in Europe and commanded premium prices. German Landsknechts, pike and halberd armed, German mercenaries who competed with the Swiss, known for elaborate clothing and brutal effectiveness. Mercenaries introduced several concepts to medieval warfare. Professionalism. Mercenaries trained regularly and maintained discipline. They were better soldiers than feudal levies. Reliability. As long as you paid them, mercenaries would fight. They wouldn't desert to return home for harvest season like peasant levies. Ruthlessness. Mercenaries had no attachment to the land they fought over. They'd burn, loot, and destroy without hesitation. But mercenaries also had major disadvantages. Cost. Professional soldiers expected regular pay. This was expensive. Loyalty. Mercenaries would switch sides if offered more money. Some would deliberately prolong wars to continue getting paid. Atrocities. Mercenary companies without pay would often loot and pillage to sustain themselves. This devastated the countryside. Free companies were mercenary bands that operated independently between contracts. When not hired, they'd essentially become bandits, raiding for supplies and money. During the Hundred Years' War, free companies devastated parts of France. When there was a truce and they weren't needed, they'd raid villages and towns for loot. Local populations were terrorized. Some free companies became powerful enough to threaten kingdoms. The Catalan Company conquered territory. Other companies extorted cities, demanding payment not to attack. Mercenary warfare reached its peak in Renaissance Italy, where city-states hired condottieri to fight each other. These wars were often low-casualty affairs because condottieri didn't want to risk their valuable soldiers. Employers didn't want to pay for long campaigns. Everyone was professional and understood the economics. There are accounts of Italian battles where both sides maneuvered for days, then negotiated a settlement without fighting. Sometimes one condottiere would bribe the other to switch sides mid-battle. This was warfare as business, not crusade or ideological conflict. The shift toward mercenaries represented a fundamental change in how wars were fought, from feudal obligation to monetary contract, from noble duty to professional service. This transition would continue into the early modern period, eventually leading to standing armies of professional soldiers that replaced both feudal levies and mercenaries. Chapter 36: Women in Medieval Warfare. Here's a topic that doesn't get enough attention: women's roles in medieval warfare. The simple narrative is that men fought and women didn't. Like most simple narratives, it's not entirely accurate. Women rarely fought as soldiers in medieval armies. That much is true. Medieval society had strict gender roles, and combat was considered men's work. But women were involved in warfare in several ways. Siege defense. When a castle was besieged and the lord was away, the lady of the castle might organize the defense. Women would coordinate defenders, manage supplies, maintain morale, sometimes directly participate in defense. Nicolaya de la Haye defended Lincoln Castle against siege in 1191 and again in 1217. She commanded the garrison and held out until relief arrived. Black Agnes, Countess of Dunbar, defended Dunbar Castle against English siege in 1338. She reportedly taunted the English besiegers and personally helped repair walls damaged by siege engines. Camp followers. Medieval armies traveled with large numbers of camp followers, mostly women who cooked and cleaned for soldiers, provided medical care, such as it was, did laundry and mending, sometimes engaged in prostitution, foraged for supplies. Camp followers were essential to army function, but were also vulnerable. When an army was defeated, camp followers were often captured, raped, or killed. Logistics and supply. Noble. Women often managed estates while their husbands were at war. This meant organizing supplies for armies, managing finances, recruiting soldiers, coordinating logistics. Eleanor of Aquitaine participated in the Second Crusade with her first husband, King Louis VII of France. While she didn't fight, she organized logistics and participated in strategic decisions. A few women actually fought. Joan of Arc is the most famous example. In 1429, she led French forces to multiple victories, breaking the siege of Orléans and turning the tide of the Hundred Years' War. She wore armor, carried a banner, and participated in battles. Whether Joan actually fought with weapons or primarily served as a morale figure and strategic advisor is debated. Contemporary accounts vary, but she was definitely present at battles and risked her life. The English eventually captured her, tried her for heresy, partly for wearing men's clothing, and burned her at stake. She was 19. There are scattered accounts of other women fighting. Joanna, Duchess of Brittany, defended Hennebon against siege in 1342, allegedly leading sorties herself. Petronilla, Countess of Leicester, defended her castle in 1173. Various accounts of women disguising themselves as men to fight, but these were exceptional cases. The vast majority of women didn't fight. Women suffered enormously from warfare. Rape was common when cities or villages were captured. Medieval armies had little discipline regarding sexual violence. Widowhood. War killed husbands, leaving women to survive alone with children. Medieval widows had some legal rights, but limited economic opportunities. Starvation. When armies stripped the countryside of food, women and children starved alongside men. Slavery. Captured women might be enslaved or forced into prostitution. The idea of women as passive victims is also incomplete. Women showed remarkable resilience in wartime. Managing estates and communities in men's absence, defending homes and castles, sustaining families during occupation, rebuilding after devastation. Medieval warfare was a men's domain, but women's experiences and contributions were significant, even if often invisible, in military chronicles written by men. Jur, Part 7, Conclusion and Legacy. Chapter 37, The End of Medieval Warfare. So when did medieval warfare end? There's no single date, but most historians point to the late 15th and early 16th centuries as the transition period. Several developments marked the end of medieval warfare and the beginning of early modern warfare. Gunpowder dominance. By 1500, cannons and firearms were standard military equipment. Artillery could destroy castle walls. Arquebusiers and musketeers were replacing archers and crossbowmen. The Battle of Pavia in 1525 is often cited as a turning point. Spanish arquebusiers massacred French heavy cavalry, capturing King Francis I of France. This demonstrated that firearms had made armored cavalry obsolete. Knights in full plate armor were now vulnerable to a peasant with a gun. The entire social structure of medieval warfare, where aristocratic warriors dominated, was collapsing. Standing armies, feudal levies, and mercenary companies were being replaced by permanent professional armies, maintained by states. Charles VII of France established the Compagnies d'Ordonnance in 1445, permanent military units paid by the crown. This was a prototype for modern standing armies. Standing armies meant better training and discipline, standardized equipment, more effective command structure, year-round availability. The feudal system was dying, and with it, feudal military obligations, new fortifications. Castles couldn't withstand cannon fire, so military engineers developed new fortification styles. The Tres Italiens, Star Fort, emerged in the 16th century. Low, thick walls with angular bastions designed to deflect cannon fire. These new fortifications were so expensive that only major states could afford them. The age of every minor noble having their own castle was over. Professionalization. Warfare became more systematic and professional. Manuals on tactics and strategy were published. Officer training became formalized. The romantic ideal of the knight gave way to the professional soldier. The invention of printing meant military knowledge could be disseminated widely. Commanders could study tactics and history rather than just relying on personal experience. Pike and shot. The dominant tactical formation became tercio in Spanish armies, a combination of pikemen and arquebusiers, musketeers working together. Pikemen protected the shooters from cavalry. Shooters provided firepower. This combination dominated European battlefields for over a century until the invention of the bayonet, which turned every musketeer into a pikeman, made pike-only troops obsolete. Nationalism. Wars were increasingly fought between nation-states, rather, than feudal lords. The 100 Years' War was an early example. England versus France as national entities, not just rival kings. National identity was becoming more important than feudal loyalty. Soldiers fought for France or England, not just for their local lord. The 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, is sometimes considered the first modern war, fought by professional armies, using gunpowder weapons extensively, causing massive devastation. But it also retained some medieval characteristics, like mercenary companies and religious motivation. By 1650, medieval warfare was definitively over. The age of gunpowder had arrived. Chapter 38: What Medieval Warfare Teaches Us. Looking back at medieval warfare from our modern perspective, what can we learn? Technology shapes warfare, but doesn't determine it. The stirrup, longbow, pike, and gunpowder all revolutionized warfare, but technology alone didn't win wars. Tactics, logistics, morale, and leadership mattered just as much. Modern. Militaries still grapple with this. Having the best technology doesn't guarantee victory. Just ask the Americans in Vietnam or Afghanistan. Logistics are fundamental. Medieval armies that neglected logistics, food, water, supplies, communication, failed regardless of how brave or skilled their soldiers were. This remains true. Modern military doctrine emphasizes logistics extensively because you can't fight if you can't sustain your forces. Defensive advantages. Medieval castles showed that a small force in a good defensive position could resist a much larger attacking force. This defensive advantage persisted through WWI trench warfare to modern urban warfare. Attackers needed 3-1 or higher numerical superiority to overcome defenders. This ratio holds remarkably consistent across military history. Morale matters. Medieval battles were often decided by morale collapse and rout rather than physical destruction of the enemy. Armies would break and run when they lost confidence. Modern militaries recognize morale as critically important. An army that won't fight is useless regardless of equipment. The human cost. Medieval warfare devastated populations through direct violence, disease, starvation, and economic destruction. Civilians suffered more than soldiers. This pattern repeated through WWI, WW2, and modern conflicts. War destroys societies, not just armies. Technological innovation. Medieval warfare drove innovation in metallurgy, engineering, chemistry, gunpowder, logistics, medicine, and organization. Military necessity has always been a driver of technological advancement. Many modern technologies, internet, GPS, radar, emerged from military needs. The disconnect between ideal and reality. Medieval chivalry prescribed honor, mercy, and noble conduct. Reality was brutal, cynical, and often horrific. Every era has this disconnect between how we think war should be fought and how it actually is. The Geneva Conventions prescribe humane treatment of prisoners and civilians, but violations are common. Economic factors. Wars were often won or lost based on who could afford to keep fighting. The richest states had advantages in equipment, logistics, and ability to sustain long campaigns. This remains true. Modern warfare is incredibly expensive. Economic power translates to military power. The unpredictability of war. Despite careful planning, medieval battles often ended in unexpected ways. Mud at Agincourt, fog at Barnet, disease at Acre. Factors beyond commanders' control determined outcomes. Clausewitz called this friction, all the things that can go wrong in war. It's still relevant. No battle plan survives contact with the enemy. Chapter 39: The Myth versus Reality. Let's address the massive gap between popular perception of medieval warfare and the reality. Myth. Knights were noble, honorable warriors who followed chivalry. Reality. Knights were aristocratic warriors who sometimes followed codes of conduct when fighting other nobles, but regularly committed atrocities against commoners. Chivalry was a marketing campaign, not reality. Myth. Medieval battles were organized, disciplined affairs. Reality. Medieval battles were chaotic, confused, terrifying experiences where commanders lost control almost immediately, and soldiers often didn't know what was happening. Myth. Swords were the primary weapon. Reality. Spears, polearms, and missile weapons killed far more people than swords. Swords were sidearms and status symbols. Myth. Armor made you invulnerable. Reality. Armor provided good protection against some weapons, but made you slower, hotter, and more likely to drown or suffocate. and it was expensive, so most soldiers didn't have much. Myth: castles were romantic fortresses. Reality: castles were military installations designed to project power and control territory. They were often uncomfortable, cold, and during sieges became disease-ridden death traps. Myth: medieval: people were incompetent at warfare. Reality: medieval commanders and soldiers developed sophisticated tactics within the constraints of their technology and knowledge. They weren't stupid, just working with different tools. Myth: combat was honorable and clean. Reality: medieval combat was brutal, dirty, painful, and often involved war crimes by modern standards. Wounded soldiers were dispatched on the battlefield. Prisoners were massacred. Civilians were targeted deliberately. Myth: medieval armies were massive. Reality: most medieval armies were 5,000, 20,000 men. The huge armies of medieval chronicles are usually exaggerated. Logistics limited army size. Myth: battles decided wars. Reality: sieges, disease, economics, and politics decided most wars. Battles were relatively rare and often inconclusive. Myth: knights charged around on horses in plate armor all day. Reality: war horses could only charge a few times before exhaustion. Knights often fought dismounted. Plate armor was late medieval, and even then not universal. Myth: medieval warfare was static and unchanging. Reality: medieval warfare evolved constantly over 1,000 years. Early medieval warfare looked nothing like late medieval warfare. The romanticization of medieval warfare began in the medieval period itself with chivalric literature and has continued through Hollywood and video games. The reality was far less glamorous. Chapter 40: Final Thoughts: What War Really Looked Like. So after 20,000 words, what was medieval warfare actually like for the common soldier? Conscripted against your will, given minimal training and poor equipment, marched long distances in bad weather, fed terrible food, drank contaminated water, more likely to die from disease than combat. If you fought in battle, it was terrifying chaos. If wounded, you'd probably die from infection. If you survived, you returned to poverty with possible PTSD. For the knight, trained from childhood for warfare, equipped with the best available technology, part of an elite military class, expected to display courage and skill, could make fortunes from ransoms and loot, but also could die in a muddy field or rot in a dungeon, and by the late Middle Ages, becoming obsolete for commanders, responsible for thousands of lives, limited ability to control battles once they started, dependent on logistics, weather, disease, and luck. One bad decision could destroy an army. Success brought glory and wealth. Failure brought death or disgrace. For civilians, suffered from armies marching through their lands, crops destroyed, livestock taken, villages burned, people killed, daughters raped, sons conscripted, starved during and after wars. No voice in whether wars happened. Just tried to survive. Medieval warfare was brutal, chaotic, disease-ridden, and traumatic for everyone involved. It wasn't glorious or romantic. It was hard men doing terrible things to each other and to civilians, for reasons that often made little sense. But it was also the crucible that forged European society. Medieval warfare shaped political boundaries that still exist, drove technological innovation, created social structures and hierarchies, influenced culture, literature, and art, established military traditions that continue today. When you see medieval castles in Europe, you're looking at military infrastructure from a brutal age. When you read about knights and chivalry, you're reading sanitized versions of warriors who were often glorified thugs. When you hear about famous battles, remember that thousands of men died terrible deaths in mud and blood. The Middle Ages lasted roughly 1,000 years. Warfare shaped that entire period. The societies that emerged from medieval Europe, eventually becoming modern nation-states, were forged through centuries of conflict. Was medieval warfare more brutal than modern warfare? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Medieval soldiers faced disease and medical care far worse than modern soldiers, but they weren't annihilated by artillery barrages or carpet bombing. Medieval civilians suffered terribly from raids and sieges, but they weren't subjected to industrial-scale genocide or nuclear weapons. What's clear is that warfare has always been hell. The technology changes, the tactics evolve, the scale increases or decreases, but the fundamental reality that war causes immense suffering, destroys lives and societies, and should be avoided when possible, remains constant. The medieval period shows us that. War is often conducted for trivial reasons. Soldiers suffer regardless of the cause. Civilians suffer more than soldiers. Disease and logistics matter more than heroism. Technology shapes, but doesn't determine outcomes. Economic factors are crucial. Leadership and morale are decisive. Nothing goes according to plan. The reality is always worse than the propaganda. If there's a lesson from medieval warfare, it's this. War is terrible. It's always been terrible, and it will always be terrible. The romantic image of knights in honor is a lie. We tell ourselves to make it bearable. The men who fought at Agincourt, Crécy, Hattin, and thousands of other battles weren't heroes in shining armor. They were scared, exhausted, disease-ridden men trying not to die in a muddy field far from home, fighting for causes they probably didn't understand, in wars that often achieved nothing. So the next time you watch a medieval battle in a movie or play a video game set in the Middle Ages, remember the reality. Remember the dysentery. Remember the starvation. Remember the infections. Remember the screaming. Remember the civilians massacred. Remember that for every knight in shining armor, there were 1,000 peasants who suffered and died in anonymity. That's what war really looked like in the Middle Ages. It looked like hell. And in many ways, it still does. You've made it through. 20,000 words about medieval warfare. You now know more about this topic than 99% of people alive today. You know that medieval battles weren't like the movies. You know that castles were military installations, not romantic fortresses. You know that disease killed more soldiers than swords. You know that logistics mattered more than courage. You know that civilians suffered most. You also know some absolutely wild facts. A teenager hacked into Rockstar. Wait, wrong script. Soldiers at Agincourt drowned in mud. Castle defenders were sometimes climbed through toilet chutes. Horses hated running into spears. Medieval doctors treated wounds with animal dung. Armies sometimes launched plague-infected corpses with trebuchets. The average peasant soldier had maybe 2 weeks of training. A full suit of armor cost as much as a village. Medieval warfare was 1,000 years of humanity figuring out increasingly creative ways to kill each other and increasingly elaborate ways to avoid being killed. It gave us castles, chivalry, longbows, plate armor, siege engines, and military tactics that influenced warfare for centuries. It also gave us a massive body count, destroyed civilizations, devastated economies, and caused suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. Was it worth studying? Absolutely, because understanding medieval warfare helps us understand how modern European nations formed, why certain technologies developed, how logistics and economics shape conflicts, the gap between military propaganda and reality, the human cost of war across all eras. Plus, some of it was genuinely fascinating. The engineering behind castles and siege weapons was remarkable. The tactics used by commanders like Edward III and Joan of Arc were brilliant. The courage displayed by soldiers on all sides, even when fighting for questionable causes, was real. Medieval warfare was complicated, contradictory, and deeply human. It was simultaneously terrible and fascinating, brutal and innovative, senseless and historically important. So the next time someone tells you they want to live in medieval times, ask them if they're ready for dysentery, arrow storms, and a 30% chance of dying from an infected wound. The Middle Ages were a hell of a time to be alive. Emphasis on hell. Thanks for sticking with this deep dive into what war actually looked like in the Middle Ages. It was dark, it was brutal, it was often disgusting, but it was real. And now you know.